Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Let the weight of the day release from your shoulders, and let the darkness around you become something gentle, the darkness of a quiet room at the end of a life, where the noise of the world has finally receded, and what remains is only what was always true. Tonight we listen to the hospice nurses. The people who sit at the threshold, who have been present at more deaths than most of us will witness in a lifetime, who have held the hands of the dying and the hands of the people who loved them, and who have accumulated in the course of that work an understanding of what the end of a life actually looks like that is not available from any other vantage point. They have seen what we have not seen. They want to tell us what they know. This is their testimony. 1. The threshold where everything becomes clear. The hospice nurse occupies a position in the human world that has no direct equivalent in any other profession. A position at the threshold between the living life and the ended one, in which the ordinary distances that the healthy person maintains between themselves and the full reality of mortality are not available, and in which the work of the day consists, in its most essential form, of being genuinely present with the person who is in the process of leaving the world, and with the people who love them and who are in the process of being left. This is not a comfortable position. It is not a position that most people would choose in the abstract, when they are thinking about it from the safety of the ordinary life. It is a position that the nurses who occupy it describe as the most clarifying work available to a human being, the work that strips away everything that the ordinary life uses to postpone the central questions, and that requires the person doing it to stand, day after day, in the presence of those questions without the luxury of deferral. What the hospice nurse accumulates in the course of this work is not primarily the clinical knowledge of the dying process, though that knowledge is real and extensive and important. What they accumulate is the understanding of what the dying and their families most consistently need, most consistently regret, most consistently find comfort from, and most consistently wish they had known earlier. This understanding is not available from the textbook or the medical school curriculum. It is available from the years of the actual work, from the thousands of hours of sitting with the person who is leaving, of attending to the family that is staying, of witnessing the full range of what the human being does and says, and is in the conditions of the final passage. The nurses who have done this work for years, and who are willing to share what it has taught them, are offering something that the ordinary life does not provide: the view from the threshold, the account of what the end actually looks like from the position of the person who has been there more times than they can count, and who has distilled from the accumulation the things that most need to be said to the people who have not yet been there, and who one day will be. 2. The dying rarely die the way they fear they will. Among the most consistent and the most immediately useful pieces of knowledge that the hospice nurse carries, knowledge that is directly applicable to the person who is afraid of the dying process, whether their own or someone they love, is the knowledge that the dying process, as it is actually experienced by the person going through it, is almost universally different from the way it is imagined in advance, and different in the direction of being considerably less terrible than the imagination predicts. The fear of dying tends to organize itself around a set of imagined horrors: the prolonged agony, the loss of all dignity, the gasping for breath that cannot be obtained, the being alone in the final moment. These fears are real and they are understandable, and they are, in the experience of hospice nurses who have attended hundreds of deaths, not the accurate description of what actually happens in the majority of cases. The dying process in the hospice context is managed with medications and positioning, and the continuous presence of attentive care in ways that address the specific physical discomforts that the dying person experiences. The active dying phase, the final hours and days, tends to produce, in the person going through it, a progressive withdrawal from the ordinary consciousness of the world, rather than a progressive increase in the suffering that the fear of dying tends to predict. The nurse who has attended many deaths describes the actual dying process not as the violent rupture of the imagined horror, but as something considerably more gradual and considerably more peaceful. A slow withdrawal from the outer world and a deepening of the interior state, in which the person is progressively less present in the ordinary sense and progressively more present in a different and quieter sense that the people who have witnessed it consistently describe as something other than what they expected. This is not the denial of the genuine difficulty of some deaths. It is the honest account of the majority, which is more peaceful than most people, living in the fear of the imagined version, are equipped to believe. 3. The body knows what it is doing. One of the things that hospice nurses most consistently want families to understand, and one of the things that families most consistently find difficult to accept in the practical conditions of the bedside, is that the dying body is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what the dying body is designed to do, following a process that is as natural and as ordered as the process of birth, and that the family's understandable impulse to intervene and to reverse and to fix is, in many cases, working against the natural process rather than supporting it. The dying person who stops eating and drinking is not starving to death in the way that the healthy person who stops eating would be starving. The body of the dying person has shifted its priorities from the maintenance of the metabolic processes of the living body to the winding down of those processes, and the cessation of the desire for food and water is part of that winding down rather than a problem to be corrected. The hospice nurse who explains this to the family at the bedside is not counseling abandonment. They are counseling understanding, the understanding that the body knows what it is doing, that the process it is following is its own natural process, and that the intervention that the family wants to make is, in many cases, more about the family's own distress than about the dying person's comfort. The wisdom the hospice nurse offers about this is the wisdom of the trusted process, the invitation to stand back from the intervention long enough to observe what the body is actually doing, and to ask whether the doing of it looks like suffering or like something else, something quieter and more purposeful, that the fear of the loss has been preventing the family from seeing clearly. The dying process is the body's final act of competence. The nurses who have witnessed it many times describe it with a respect that the family in the room does not yet have the experience to access, but that the nurse is there to model. 4. What the dying actually need. The question of what the dying person actually needs, as distinct from what the family believes they need, what the medical system is equipped to provide, and what the cultural narrative of the good death tends to prescribe, is one that hospice nurses are in a uniquely qualified position to answer, because they have asked it of many dying people in the conditions where the dying person is capable of answering it honestly, and because the answers they have received have been, across years of the asking, remarkably consistent. What the dying actually need is not primarily medical. The medical needs are real, and they are addressed by the hospice program with the care and the competence that the clinical management of the dying process requires. But the primary need, the need that the dying person expresses most urgently and most consistently when they are given the conditions in which the honest expression is possible, is not medical. It is relational, and it is presence. The dying need to be with the people they love. They need those people to be actually present, present in the room, present in the conversation, present in the silence, present without the performing of a cheerfulness that the dying person can see through, and that places between the person and the family the specific distance of the managed emotion. They need to be allowed to talk about dying if they want to talk about it, and not to talk about it if they don't. They need to know that the people they love will be all right after they are gone. And they need, more than almost anything else the hospice nurse consistently observes them needing, to know that they mattered, that the life they lived and the people they loved and the things they did and were are genuinely valued by the people who are remaining. The need is not complicated. The meeting of it requires only the willingness to be genuinely there. The genuinely there is what the hospice nurse spends their working life trying to help families understand how to be. 5. The things left unsaid are the heaviest. The hospice nurse who has worked in end-of-life care for years accumulates, alongside the clinical knowledge of the dying process, an understanding of the specific form of suffering that is not physical and that the clinical management of the dying process cannot address. The suffering of the things left unsaid, the words that the dying person wanted to say and did not say, and the words that the family wanted to say and did not say, and the long, cumulative weight of the unexpressed that both parties carry into the final days, and that neither party, in the conditions of the last hours, always manages to discharge. The hospice nurse who has sat with families in the final period describes the specific quality of the regret that the unsaid word produces in the people who are left. The regret that is not the ordinary regret of the missed opportunity, but the more permanent regret of the missed opportunity that has now closed permanently. The apology that was not made. The love that was felt but not expressed, or not expressed fully, or not expressed in the specific form that the person who needed to hear it would have been able to receive it. The forgiveness that was not asked for and not given. These things do not close with the death. They are carried into the subsequent years by the people who survive, unchanged by the passage of time, the unresolved weight of the communication that could have happened and did not. What the hospice nurse most consistently wants families to understand about this dimension of the experience is that the window, while it remains open, should be used. Not in the dramatic and artificial sense of forcing conversations that neither party is ready for, but in the simple, direct, honest sense of saying what is genuinely felt while the saying is still possible. The nurse who has watched families hold the hand of the dying person and speak the words that had been waiting for years describes the receiving of those words by the dying person, the specific quality of the peace that the hearing of them produces, as one of the most important and the most reliably comforting things available in the final period. Say it, the window is open now, it will not always be. 6. Most people are not afraid of death itself. One of the most consistently surprising findings in the hospice nurse's experience, surprising to the families who bring their assumptions about what the dying person is afraid of into the room with them, is the discovery that the dying person, in the majority of cases, is not primarily afraid of death itself. They are afraid of other things, of the process of dying, of the loss of the people they love, of the specific practical consequences of their absence for the people who depended on them. But the death itself, the cessation, the ending, the passage, is not, in the experience of the hospice nurse who has talked honestly with many dying people about what they are facing, the primary source of the fear. The fear of death tends to be the living person's fear rather than the dying person's fear. The healthy person, thinking about death from the position of the person who has everything to lose and who is not yet in the process of losing it, tends to experience the prospect of death as the ultimate threat, the cancellation of the entire enterprise of the life, the removal of everything that is valued and enjoyed and anticipated. This fear is not irrational. It is the appropriate response to the contemplation of the end from the position of the living. The dying person, in the conditions of the actual dying process, tends to experience their situation differently. The progressive withdrawal from the outer world that the dying process produces changes the relationship to the world's goods in ways that the healthy person, still fully invested in those goods, cannot easily anticipate. The things that seemed most important in the living life tend to recede as the dying process advances, and what remains in the foreground is not the loss of those things, but the presence of the people and the relationships, and the quality of the immediate experience of the current moment. The dying person is rarely where the healthy person imagines them to be emotionally. The hospice nurse who knows where the dying person actually tends to be is the most useful person in the room. 7. The last sense to go is hearing. Among the things that hospice nurses most urgently and most consistently want families to know, and among the things that families most consistently wish they had known earlier, is the clinical fact that hearing is the last sense to diminish in the dying person, and that the dying person who appears to be unconscious and unreachable may, in the assessment of the nurses who have the most experience with this dimension of the dying process, be hearing and processing what is being said in the room far longer than the family's assessment of their level of consciousness would suggest. The family that assumes the dying person cannot hear them, that speaks freely about the dying person in the third person, that has the conversations about practical arrangements at the bedside, that says the difficult things that were left unsaid in the prior years, in a voice that the dying person's apparent unconsciousness seems to make safe, may be wrong about the apparent unconsciousness. The hospice nurse who has been at many bedsides where the dying person has, in the hours or days following an apparently unconscious period, described what was said in the room during that period, carries a very different assessment of the dying person's interior life in the final stage of the process than the external appearance of that stage tends to suggest. The practical counsel that the hospice nurse derives from this understanding is the counsel that families consistently receive and consistently describe as one of the most important things they were told. Speak to the dying person as though they can hear you, because in many cases they can. Say what you need to say. Play the music they loved. Read aloud from the book that mattered. Describe the world outside the window. Hold the hand and speak in the voice that they knew. The hearing may be the last thing that connects the person who is leaving to the world they are leaving, and the sounds of that world, and the voices of the people they love, may be the last things they carry with them. 8. The dying wait for permission. One of the most consistent and the most moving observations in the hospice nurses' experience, the observation that nurses describe most often when they are asked what they most want people to understand about the dying process, is the observation that the dying person frequently waits for something before they are able to die. That the death, when it arrives, often arrives in the hours or the minutes after a specific thing has occurred, and that the specific thing is, in the most common pattern, the permission of the people they love. The dying person who is holding on past the point at which the medical assessment would have predicted the death, who is maintaining a life that appears to have ended by any measure that the clinical assessment can apply, is sometimes, not always, but often enough that the observation is one of the most consistent in the hospice literature, waiting for the specific person who has not yet arrived to say goodbye. Or waiting for the specific conflict that has not yet been resolved to be resolved, or the specific forgiveness that has not yet been offered to be offered. Or waiting, most simply and most heartbreakingly, for the specific word from the specific person they love most that says, "It is all right, you can go, we will be all right, you do not need to stay for us." The hospice nurse who has witnessed this pattern many times carries a specific counsel for the family at the bedside. If the dying person is holding on past the expected time, speak to them. Tell them what they need to hear. Give the permission. Say the thing that releases the hold. The nurse who has watched the dying person die in the minutes after the family member finally said, "I love you, it's okay, we'll be fine," describes the specific quality of the death that followed the permission as different from the death that did not receive it, quieter. More complete, more genuinely peaceful. The permission was what they were waiting for. The family is often the only one who can give it. 9. What presence actually means. The hospice nurse who has spent years attending the dying and their families carries an understanding of what the word presence actually means in the conditions of the bedside, what it actually consists of and what it is not. That is different from the ordinary understanding of presence, as simply being in the same physical space as another person. The physical presence at the bedside is necessary but not sufficient. What the dying person needs, and what the hospice nurse consistently observes making the genuine difference, is a quality of presence that goes beyond the physical occupation of the room, the genuine, full, undivided attention of the person who is there. The family member who is in the room but whose attention is divided between the bedside and the phone, between the dying person and the management of the practical arrangements of the death, between the present moment and the anticipatory grief of the future moment, without the person they are losing. This family member is physically present and not fully there. The dying person, whose perception is often more acute in the final period than the external appearance of their condition suggests, tends to perceive the divided presence. The full presence, the presence of the person who has put everything else aside and who is simply, completely, unreservedly in the room with the dying person, is what the nurse consistently observes producing the most comfort. The full presence is difficult. The conditions of the dying person's bedside are conditions of genuine grief for the people who love them, and the management of the grief tends to produce exactly the divided attention that the full presence requires setting aside. The hospice nurse who models the full presence, who demonstrates what it looks like to be completely in the room, without the performance and without the managing, is performing one of the most important functions of the role, showing the family what the dying person most needs them to be, in the conditions where the family's own distress makes the being of it genuinely difficult. 10. What we know at 10, the view from the threshold. We have arrived at the 10th entry in our account of what hospice nurses most want people to know, and the view from the threshold, the understanding that the years of sitting with the dying and their families produces in the nurses who carry it, has by now begun to take the shape of something that deserves the name wisdom. In these first 10 entries, we have stood at the threshold with the nurses who occupy it and received the first pieces of what they have accumulated. The understanding that the dying process is not what the fear of it tends to predict, that the body knows what it is doing, and that the intervention the family wants to make is often working against the process rather than for it, that what the dying person actually needs is presence rather than medicine. That the things left unsaid are the heaviest things the survivors carry, that most dying people are not primarily afraid of death itself, that hearing is the last sense to go, and that the dying person in the apparently unconscious state may be closer to the room than the family believes, that the dying wait for permission, and that the presence that genuinely helps is the full presence rather than the divided one. These are not comfortable things to know. They require the person who receives them to revise certain comfortable assumptions about the dying process and about what the dying person most needs. They also, in the experience of the families who received them in time to act on them, produce the quality of the final period that those families most consistently describe as the thing they are most grateful for, the period that was genuinely present, genuinely honest, and genuinely adequate to the importance of what was happening. In the 90 entries that remain, the nurses continue. This is explored during Sleeping 11, the family member who doesn't come. Among the patterns that the hospice nurse observes with the most regularity and the most heartbreak is the pattern of the family member who does not come, the person who is known to exist, who is known to be capable of coming, and who does not appear at the bedside of the dying person in the final days and weeks, for reasons that the nurse does not always know and does not always ask about, but whose absence is registered by the dying person with a specificity and a persistence that the nurse has learned to recognize. The dying person who is waiting for someone who has not come is one of the most common and one of the most difficult situations the hospice nurse navigates. The waiting takes different forms. The person who asks repeatedly whether a specific family member has called, whose face shows a quality of attentiveness at every sound that might be the opening of the door. The person who holds on past the point that the medical assessment would predict, past the point where the holding on appears to be serving any comfort, in the specific way that the nurse has learned to associate with the waiting for the arrival that has not yet occurred. The dying person rarely says directly that they are waiting, they show it. The nurse learns to read the showing. What the nurse wants the family who is not there to understand, the child who has not come, the sibling who is maintaining the distance of the old conflict, the friend who finds the situation too painful to approach, is this: the window is shorter than it looks from the distance that is making it seem manageable to stay away. The regret of not coming is a specific and permanent kind of regret, different from the ordinary regrets of the ordinary life, because it is the regret of an irreversible non-action, the thing that could have been done and was not, in the window that has now closed. The nurse has watched families arrive an hour after the death whose faces carry the permanent quality of the thing that cannot now be undone. Come, whatever the reason for the distance, come. The dying person is asking for you in the only way they have left. 12. What the moment of death actually looks like. The cultural representation of the moment of death, the dramatic final breath, the last words of significance, the gathered family with the perfect closure, is, in the experience of the hospice nurse who has been present at many deaths, more the product of the narrative requirement than the actual event. The actual moment of death, in the majority of cases attended by hospice nurses, is quieter, more gradual, and more anticlimactic than the representation suggests, and the families who encounter the actual moment, having been prepared by the representation, tend to find themselves surprised by the ordinariness of it. The active dying process, the final hours and days, produces a progressive slowing and a progressive withdrawal that make the actual moment of the last breath a continuation of the process rather than a dramatic rupture of it. The breathing becomes slower and more irregular. The pauses between breaths lengthen. The final breath arrives as the last in a sequence that has been slowing for hours, and the cessation of the breathing is, in many cases, not immediately obvious to the people in the room, because the difference between the last breath and the preceding pause is the difference of permanence rather than of quality. The nurse who has attended many deaths describes the moment not as an ending in the dramatic sense, but as a completion, the final point of a process that has been underway, in some cases for days, and that reaches its conclusion with the same gradual quality that has characterized the approach to it. Families who expected the dramatic moment and encountered the quiet one sometimes need the nurse's confirmation that the death has occurred, because the actual event did not announce itself in the form they had been anticipating. This is not a failure of the moment. It is the actual character of the moment, which is gentler than the representation has prepared most people to expect. 13. The things families say that hurt without meaning to. The hospice nurse who has spent years at the bedside of the dying and their families carries, alongside the understanding of what helps, an equally detailed understanding of the things that do not help, the things that are said with genuine love and genuine good intention, and that land in ways that are, in the experience of the dying person who receives them, the opposite of what was intended. The nurse who knows these things knows them not from the theoretical consideration of what might be unhelpful, but from the observation of the dying person's response to them across many bedsides and many years. The most consistently unhelpful thing said to the dying person is the counsel to fight, the exhortation to keep fighting, to not give up, to stay strong, delivered in the language of the military metaphor that the cancer conversation in particular has adopted, and that the dying person who is ready to stop fighting hears as a request to keep struggling against a process that they have come to understand as natural, and that the fighting has not and will not reverse. The nurse who has sat with the dying person who was exhausted by the fighting that the family needed them to do, exhausted not by the illness alone, but by the guilt of not fighting hard enough, the guilt of wanting to stop, describes the cost of this well-intentioned counsel with a specificity that makes the cost clear. The second most consistently unhelpful thing is the false reassurance, the insistence that the dying person is going to be fine, when the dying person knows they are not going to be fine, and when the insistence requires them to manage the family member's emotions rather than their own. The dying person who is being told they are going to be fine is being asked to perform a reality that is not their reality, in the service of the person who needs the performance. The nurse who observes this consistently from the bedside wants families to know that the honest acknowledgement of what is actually happening is a greater kindness than the false reassurance that protects the family from the truth the dying person is already living. 14. What nurses do with their own grief. The hospice nurse is not immune to grief. This is one of the things that the nurses who do this work most consistently want people to understand, that the years at the bedside of the dying do not produce a callousness or a distance that makes the deaths less felt, but rather, in the nurses who do the work most genuinely, a cumulative depth of feeling that is different from the sharp grief of the personal loss, but that is real and that requires its own forms of acknowledgement and its own forms of care. The nurse who has attended a death that was particularly moving, the death of the young person, the death of the person whose character was exceptional, the death that occurred in conditions of particular difficulty or particular beauty, carries that death into the subsequent days of the work and into the subsequent years of the life in ways that the professional training and the professional culture of the healthcare system are not always well equipped to support. The culture of the healthcare system tends to value the management of emotion and the maintenance of the professional distance that allows the work to continue, and the nurse who is visibly affected by a death in the ordinary run of the working day may not always find the institutional support for the visible affect that the genuine human response to the death deserves. The wisdom the nurses offer about their own grief is the wisdom of the person who has learned, through the necessity of the work, to hold the grief with a genuine respect for what it represents. The evidence that the person who died mattered to the person attending them, that the death was not managed from behind a professional distance, but witnessed from the position of genuine human presence, while also developing the practices that allow the continuing with the work that the grief, left unmanaged, would make impossible. They grieve, they continue. The grieving and the continuing are not in opposition, they are the full description of what the work requires. 15. The dying person who is ready and the family that isn't. One of the most delicate and the most consistently occurring situations in the hospice setting is the situation in which the dying person and the family around them are in genuinely different places in the process, in which the dying person has arrived at the acceptance and the readiness for the death that the process eventually produces, and in which the family is not in that place and is not near it, and whose grief and resistance are visible to the dying person in ways that complicate the dying person's own experience of the final period. The dying person who is ready, who has said their goodbyes, who has made peace with what is coming, who has arrived at the state of acceptance and even in some cases of genuine peace, but who is surrounded by a family whose own grief is making the room feel like a place of crisis rather than a place of completion, is in a specific and difficult situation that the hospice nurse observes regularly and navigates with the care that the specific situation requires. The family's grief is legitimate and the expression of it is not wrong, but the specific form that the grief takes, the resistance, the bargaining, the repeated expression of the hope that the death will not occur, can create in the dying person a guilt about the dying that the dying person should not be asked to carry in the final period. The nurse wants the family to understand that the dying person's readiness is not the rejection of the family. It is the product of the dying process, the natural development of the dying person's interior through the weeks and months of the illness, and it is a gift rather than an abandonment. The dying person who has arrived at peace is not abandoning the family. They have traveled ahead to a place that the family is not yet ready to be, and the family's task, in the nurse's understanding of it, is not to bring the dying person back from that place, but to allow the dying person to be in it. The readiness is the person's own process. It deserves to be honored. 16. The role of touch. The hospice nurse who has spent years at the bedside of the dying carries a specific and detailed understanding of the role of physical touch in the final period, of what the hand held or the forehead touched or the back stroked provides to the dying person that no verbal communication and no medical intervention can provide, and of why the families who maintain the physical contact through the final hours tend to produce a quality of the dying person's experience that the families who withdraw from the physical contact do not. The dying body is not a body to be afraid of. This is one of the things the nurse most wants families to understand, and one of the things that the cultural discomfort with the dying body most consistently prevents families from acting on. The dying person who is unconscious or semi-conscious, whose body is showing the changes that the dying process produces, is still a person who can feel the warmth of the hand that is holding theirs, who can register the comfort of the physical presence at the level of the skin and the nervous system, even when the high-level communication of words and eye contact is no longer available. The touch reaches places that words cannot reach in the final hours. The nurse who has held the hand of the dying person in the absence of family, who has provided in their professional capacity the human touch that the dying person needed and that the family's absence or discomfort prevented, describes the providing of it as one of the most important things the work requires, and as the thing they most wish the family had been present to provide themselves. Hold the hand, touch the forehead, lie beside them if the dying person would have welcomed it. The body that is dying is still the body of the person who was loved. Touch it with the love that you would have touched it with before it was dying. 17. What the dying say in their final days. The things that the dying say in the days and weeks before their death, the themes and the concerns, and the specific communications that appear with the most consistency across the enormous variety of individual people and individual circumstances that the hospice nurse encounters, are among the most important pieces of testimony available from the threshold. Because they are the distillation of what people most want to communicate, when the communication is reduced to what is most essential by the conditions of the final period. The most consistent theme is love. The dying person speaks about the people they love, and the speaking is rarely a summary or an accounting. It is the direct, present-tense expression of the feeling as it exists in the moment of the speaking, urgent and complete and requiring no elaboration. I love you, I love this person. I have been loved by these people. The love is the primary content of the final communication, and the nurse who has heard it expressed in 1,000 different forms across 1,000 different bedsides carries the observation that the love does not diminish in the final period. It concentrates. The second most consistent theme is gratitude. The gratitude for the life, for the people in it, for the experiences it contained. Expressed sometimes with a completeness that the healthy life rarely achieves, and that the conditions of the final period produce in the dying person, who has had the specific time and the specific clarity of the dying process to arrive at the genuine assessment of what the life contained. Not the gratitude of the person who is pretending the life was only good. The gratitude of the person who has seen the full account and who has found, in the full account, genuine reason for the genuine feeling. 18. The gift of the honest conversation. The hospice nurse who has facilitated and witnessed the conversations between dying people and their families that were honest about what was happening, that named the death, that allowed the dying person to say what they needed to say about it, that permitted the family to ask the questions, and to express the feelings that the management of the appearance of hope had been preventing, describes those conversations as among the most valuable things available in the final period. And their occurrence as something that the dying person and the family both carry differently afterward than the conversations that were not honest. The honest conversation is not the dramatic conversation. The hospice nurse does not facilitate the tearing open of the suppressed, the forced confrontation of everything unresolved in the service of the dramatic closure that the narrative of the good death sometimes implies. The honest conversation is simpler than that. It is the conversation in which the reality of the situation is acknowledged between the people in the room, in which the dying person does not have to pretend to a hope they do not feel, and in which the family does not have to pretend to an optimism that the dying person can see through. The honesty is not about saying everything. It is about not performing the alternative. The families who had the honest conversation describe it, in the years after the death, with a quality of gratitude that the families who did not have it tend not to be able to access. The honest conversation produced a quality of presence between the dying person and the family that the managed conversation consistently prevented. The dying person could be where they actually were. The family could be with them there. The being together in the actual place, rather than in the performed alternative, is what the nurse consistently observes the dying person most needing, and what the honest conversation most reliably provides. 19. What nurses have learned about regret from the bedside. The hospice nurse's understanding of human regret, accumulated from the years of sitting with the dying and their families in the conditions of the final period, where the regret that a life contained is often more visible and more honestly expressed than at any earlier point, is one of the most practically useful pieces of knowledge available from the bedside, because it is not the theoretical account of what people tend to regret, but the observed account. Gathered from the actual testimony of the people who are closest to the end of their lives, and for whom the regret has its full and final weight. The regrets that the hospice nurse observes most consistently in the dying person are not the dramatic regrets of the spectacular failures. They are the quiet regrets of the sustained inattentions, the relationship that was not given the time it needed, the creative work that was deferred until there was no longer time for it, the words that were not said to the people who needed to hear them. The dying person who regrets the specific choice to prioritize the career over the relationship, the year over the day, the impressive over the genuine. This person is the most common person in the room, across all the different specific circumstances of all the different specific people. The nurse who carries this understanding wants people to know that the regrets are almost never about what was done. They are almost always about what was not done, not the risks taken, but the risks not taken, not the love expressed, but the love withheld, not the time spent on the things that mattered, but the time not spent on them. This finding, so consistent across the full range of the dying people the nurse has attended, is the thing the nurse most wants to offer to the people who are still in the middle of their lives. The direct, observed account of what the end of the life most consistently reveals as having been worth the time, so that the time can be spent on it while the spending is still possible. 20. What we know at 20, the shape of the threshold. We have arrived at the 20th entry in our account of what hospice nurses most want people to know, and the shape of the threshold. The understanding that the accumulated years of the work at the bedside produce in the nurses who carry it has by now taken on enough detail and enough coherence to be genuinely useful to the person receiving it. In the last 10 entries, we have received the account of the family member who does not come and the permanent quality of the regret that the not coming produces. We have learned what the moment of death actually looks like, quieter and more gradual than the representation suggests. We have heard what the well-intentioned words can do that hurt, and how the nurse carries their own grief and continues. We have been present at the situation of the dying person who is ready and the family that is not, and we have understood the role of touch in the final period. We have heard what the dying say most consistently, love and gratitude, concentrated and urgent, and we have received the gift of the honest conversation and the account of the regrets the dying most consistently carry. What these 20 entries have established is the essential character of the hospice nurse's witness: honest, practical, unglamorous, and deeply human. The nurses who do this work have been given an understanding of what matters at the end of a life that no other professional position provides, and what they want to offer from that understanding is not comfort in the false sense but usefulness, the direct account of what actually happens, what actually helps, and what the living can do differently with the time they still have. The testimony continues. This is Explore During Sleeping 21, the death that was beautiful. The hospice nurse who has attended many deaths carries, alongside the accounts of the difficult ones, the accounts of the deaths that were beautiful, and the use of the word beautiful in relation to dying is something the nurses who use it are aware requires explanation, because the word in this context does not mean pleasant or painless or free of difficulty. It means something more precise and more honest. The death that had the quality of completion, of genuine presence, of the full human gathering of the people who mattered, and the saying of what needed to be said, and the being together in the actual reality of what was happening, without the management or the performance or the false comfort that so often attends the final period. The deaths that the hospice nurse describes as beautiful are almost never the deaths that went smoothly in the clinical sense. They are the deaths that were fully inhabited by all the people in the room, the deaths at which the family was genuinely present, in which the dying person knew they were loved and said so, and was told so, in which the grief was allowed to be present alongside the love rather than being managed into the background, and in which the moment of the death arrived into a room that had been preparing for it, honestly rather than avoiding it until its arrival was unavoidable. These deaths are not rare in the hospice setting, and the nurses who have attended them carry them as the testimony of what is possible when the approach to the dying process is honest, and the people involved allow themselves to be fully present in it. The nurse wants the family preparing for the death of someone they love to know that this quality, the quality the nurse calls beautiful, is not accidental. It does not simply happen to the fortunate. It is the product of the specific decisions and the specific willingness to be genuinely in the room, to say the genuine things, to allow the dying process to be what it actually is rather than what the fear of it would prefer it to be. The beautiful death is available to most people. What it requires is not luck, but the specific courage of the genuine presence. The nurse has seen what that presence produces. They want every family to have the opportunity to produce it. 22. What nurses know about pain. The fear of pain in dying, the fear that the final period will be a period of unmanaged and unmanageable physical suffering, is one of the most consistent and the most significant sources of anxiety in the families and the patients that the hospice nurse encounters. And it is also, in the nurse's experience of the actual management of the dying process in the hospice setting, one of the fears that is most consistently unwarranted. The management of pain in the hospice setting is among the most advanced and the most reliably effective dimensions of the care, and the person who dies in the hospice setting is almost never the person dying in the unmanaged pain that the fear of the dying process tends to predict. The nurse wants families to know several things about pain at the end of life that the fear of it tends to prevent from being clearly understood. The first is that the expression of pain in the dying person is not always what it appears to be to the untrained observer, that the sounds and the movements and the facial expressions that families sometimes interpret as the signs of pain may, in the assessment of the nurse who knows the physiological changes of the dying process, be the signs of other things. The involuntary muscle activity of the transitional state, the sounds of the changed breathing pattern, the movements that have a neurological rather than a pain-related origin. The nurse's assessment of whether the dying person is in pain is a more reliable guide than the family's observation of the signs they associate with pain. The second thing the nurse wants families to know is that the medications used for pain management in the final period do not hasten death. This is one of the most persistent and the most damaging misconceptions in the family's relationship to the pain management of the dying person. The fear that the morphine or the other medications are killing the person rather than managing their comfort. and it is a misconception that the nurse encounters regularly and that, when it prevents the family from consenting to adequate pain management, causes the dying person a suffering that the nurse carries the weight of long after the death. 23. The surprising conversations of the final weeks. The dying person in the final weeks of life, the person who has moved past the acute management of the illness into the period of the preparation for the death, is, in the experience of the hospice nurse who attends them, frequently a different conversational presence than the person who occupied the same body in the prior years of the life. The final weeks tend to produce in the dying person a quality of communication that the ordinary life rarely generates, a directness, a clarity, an absence of the social management and the self-presentation that the ordinary life requires, that makes the conversations of the final weeks some of the most honest and the most memorable that the families describe having had with the dying person across the full span of their relationship. The dying person who speaks their mind about the relationship, about the life, about the things they valued and the things they regret, about the people who mattered and the people who disappointed, this dying person is producing, in the conditions of the final weeks, the honest account that the prior relationship may not have contained in the same form. The nurse who has facilitated and witnessed these conversations carries them as testimony to the specific quality of the communication that the proximity to death tends to produce. The communication of the person who is no longer organizing their words around the management of the subsequent conversation, who is no longer concerned with the specific social consequences of the specific honest expression, and who is therefore available to say what they actually mean in a way that the ordinary social life consistently prevents. The families who received these conversations describe them with a quality of gratitude that is different from the ordinary gratitude for pleasant exchanges. They describe them as gifts, as the account of the person's actual interior, offered in the conditions where the account was finally both possible and necessary, that the family is left with as the last and most honest record of who the person actually was. 24. Children at the bedside. The question of whether to bring children to the bedside of the dying, the question that parents and families navigate with anxiety in the hospice setting, uncertain whether the presence of a child at the death of a grandparent or a parent or a sibling will cause a harm that cannot be undone, is one that the hospice nurse has encountered regularly and has developed, through the direct observation of the outcomes of the different decisions, a genuine and evidence-based position on. The position is not universal, and the nurse does not offer it as a prescription for every family in every circumstance. It is the observation of what the nurse has seen produce harm and what the nurse has seen produce something else. What the nurse has observed, across many years of the work, is that the exclusion of children from the reality of the dying process, the decision to protect the child from the knowledge and the experience of the death by keeping them away from the bedside and managing the information they receive about what is happening, tends to produce in the child a specific confusion and a specific fear that the direct experience of the dying, even in its difficult dimensions, does not. The child who was kept away from the grandmother's death and who was told afterward that grandmother is gone, tends to carry a relationship to the death that is shaped by the imagination of it rather than the experience of it, and the imagination tends to produce something more frightening than the reality. The child who was present at the bedside, who was told honestly what was happening in terms appropriate to their age, who was allowed to hold the hand or to speak to the person who was dying, who was given the actual experience of the actual process, tends, in the nurse's observation, to carry a relationship to the death that is integrated in a way that the excluded child's relationship is not. The death was real. The child was part of it. The part they played was not harmful. It was the genuine experience of the human reality that their life will require them to navigate, offered in the presence of the people who love them, and with the support of the people who are equipped to help them understand it. 25. The dying person who is angry. The dying person who is angry, whose response to the diagnosis and the prognosis and the conditions of the dying process is not acceptance or peace but genuine, expressed, sometimes fierce anger, is a person that the hospice nurse encounters regularly and that the families of those persons sometimes find the most difficult to be within the final period. The anger is frightening to the family, who want the dying period to have the quality of the acceptance and the peace that the cultural narrative of the good death tends to prescribe, and whose own discomfort with the dying process is amplified by the dying person's refusal to be comforted in the way that the family's management of their own distress requires them to be comforted. The nurse wants the family of the angry dying person to understand that the anger is legitimate. The person is dying. The dying was not chosen, was not deserved, may be arriving earlier than justice would require, and is removing from the person everything they valued about their life and everything they anticipated about their future. The anger at this situation is the appropriate response to an appropriate assessment of the situation. It is not a problem to be solved. It is not a stage to be moved through. It is the honest, emotional response of a person who has been placed in a genuinely terrible situation and who is expressing their response to that situation with a directness that the social management of the terminal diagnosis has not always allowed. The nurse who has sat with the angry dying person and who has allowed the anger to be present without requiring it to become something else, who has not tried to redirect the dying person toward acceptance or to manage the anger into the background in the service of the family's comfort, describes the quality of the relationship that this allowing produces between the nurse and the dying person as one of the most genuine available in the hospice setting. The dying person whose anger is received rather than managed tends to experience a quality of being genuinely witnessed that the managed version of their experience would not have produced. The anger, received honestly, often transforms into something else in its own time. The transformation cannot be forced, it can only be waited for. In the presence of the person who is not frightened by the anger and who does not require it to stop. 26. What nurses have observed about the timing of death. The timing of death, the question of when the death actually occurs, within the range of the prognosis that the medical assessment has provided, is one of the most consistently surprising dimensions of the hospice nurse's experience. Surprising because the dying process consistently demonstrates a relationship to timing that the purely medical assessment does not predict, and that the nurses who observe it regularly have come to understand as reflecting something about the dying person's interior that the medical model does not account for. The dying person frequently dies at a time that seems, in retrospect, to reflect a relationship to the people and the events surrounding them that goes beyond the purely physiological. The person who holds on for the arrival of the specific family member. The person who dies in the minutes after the last family member steps out of the room, who dies, apparently, in the brief solitude that was the first available solitude in a vigil that had maintained continuous company for days. The person who dies on a date that has a specific significance in their personal history. These observations are not universal, and the nurse does not claim that every death demonstrates this quality, but they occur with enough frequency and with enough specificity to have become one of the most consistent features of the nurse's experience of the dying process. What the nurse most wants families to understand about the timing is this: do not feel guilty if you were not in the room. The person who dies in the brief moment of the family member's absence, and this is one of the most common and one of the most painful experiences for the family, may have chosen the solitude. The nurse who has observed this pattern many times does not believe it is accidental. The dying person's relationship to the presence of the people they love is complicated by the love itself, and the person who has been protecting their family from the distress of witnessing the death may use the brief available solitude to complete the process. It was not an abandonment, it may have been a last act of protection. 27. The person who dies alone. The person who dies alone, without family present, without anyone who loved them in the room, in the hours or the minutes when the vigil that had been maintained is briefly interrupted, is one of the dimensions of the hospice nurse's experience that the families who were not present tend to carry with the most difficulty, and one that the nurse's observation of many such deaths has given them a more nuanced understanding of than the simple narrative of the lonely death tends to provide. The nurse has been present at deaths that were alone in the conventional sense, in which no family was present in the room, and has observed the quality of those deaths from the position of the professional who was there even when the family was not. The observation is not that the deaths were tragic, or that the person suffered from the absence of the family. Many of those deaths were, in the nurse's direct observation, as peaceful and as complete as deaths attended by a room full of the people who loved the person. The dying process does not require the audience. The completion of it does not depend on the presence of witnesses. The person who died while the family was in the hallway getting coffee did not die in the experience of abandonment. They died in the completion of a process that was their own and that was, in its final moments, private. The nurse wants the families who were not present, who arrived to find the death had occurred in the brief window of their absence, to receive this. The dying person knew they were loved. The absence of the body in the room in the final moment is not the absence of the love, and the dying person does not experience the final moment as an accounting of who was and was not present. They experience it as the final moment. And the final moment, in the nurse's observation, tends to be quieter and more self-contained than the vigil that precedes it. 28. How people lived and how they die. The hospice nurse who has attended many deaths carries an observation about the relationship between how people lived their lives and how they die that is one of the most consistently described and the most philosophically significant pieces of testimony available from the bedside. The observation is not universal. There are exceptions, and the nurse is careful not to overclaim, but it appears with enough consistency to constitute a genuine pattern in the nurse's experience. The person who lived with a quality of genuine presence and genuine openness tends to die with a similar quality, and the person who lived with a quality of sustained resistance and sustained control tends to die with more difficulty in the releasing of both. The person who was genuinely present in their relationships, who expressed what they felt and received what was offered, who did not manage their own emotional life into a performance for the benefit of the surrounding audience. This person tends to arrive at the dying process with a smaller backlog of the unresolved and the unexpressed. And the smaller backlog tends to produce a dying process that is less complicated by the specific work of the unfinished business that the well-managed life accumulated without finishing. The dying process does not require the person to arrive having resolved everything, but the person who arrives with less to resolve tends to have more of the available energy for the process itself, rather than for the simultaneous management of the unresolved. The nurse offers this not as a judgment, but as an observation, as the testimony of the person who has seen enough of both to draw a comparison, and whose comparison is available as information for the person who is still in the middle of the living. The dying process will be whatever it will be, but the life that precedes it shapes the conditions of the arriving, and the nurse who has seen the arriving many times has a genuine sense of the conditions that produce the more peaceful version. 29. The comfort of the familiar. Among the things that the hospice nurse observes providing the most reliable comfort to the dying person in the final period, comfort that is available regardless of the state of consciousness, comfort that reaches the dying person in the conditions where verbal communication is no longer possible and where the clinical interventions have reached their limits, is the comfort of the familiar. The sounds, the smells, the music, the voices, the sensory presences that the dying person has been surrounded by across the full span of their life, and that arrive at the bedside in the final period as the specific evidence that the world they are leaving is still present around them. The music that was loved throughout the life, played softly in the room in the final hours, produces in the dying person a response that the nurse observes with a consistency that makes the playing of it one of the most reliable interventions available in the final period. The response is not always visible. The dying person who appears unconscious does not always demonstrate the physical response that would make the response obvious. But the nurse who has attended many deaths in which the loved music was played carries the observation that the quality of the dying person's experience of the final hours, whatever the quality of the external demonstration, is changed by the presence of the familiar sound in ways that the silence or the unfamiliar sound does not change it. The smell of the familiar, the specific soap or the specific perfume, or the specific quality of the familiar environment reproduced in the unfamiliar setting of the hospital or the hospice room, is another of the familiar presences that the nurse observes providing the comfort that the clinical interventions cannot reach. The family that brings these things to the bedside is providing something that no medical intervention can provide. The sensory evidence of the entire life surrounding the dying person in the final hours, the confirmation that the world is still there, that the familiar is still present, that the leaving is from a world that was genuinely inhabited and genuinely loved. 30. What we know at 30, the nurse's witness. We have arrived at the 30th entry, and the testimony of the hospice nurse has by now covered a sufficient range of the dying process and its human dimensions to constitute a genuine account of what the bedside teaches that no other position can teach. In the last 10 entries, we received the account of the death that was beautiful and what makes it so. We learned what the nurse knows about pain that the fear of it obscures. We heard the surprising conversations of the final weeks, the honest question of children at the bedside, and the account of the angry dying person whose anger deserves to be received rather than managed. We received the observation about the timing of death, the dying person who waits and the dying person who chooses the brief solitude, and the account of the death that occurred without the family present and what the nurse observed about its quality. We heard the relationship between how people lived and how they die, and we received the profound comfort of the familiar in the final hours. What the 30 entries assembled here have established is the essential character of the hospice nurse's knowledge, deeply practical, honestly observed, and consistently directed toward the same essential understanding, that the dying process is more manageable and more human and more available to be genuinely inhabited by the people who are in it than the fear of it allows most people to believe until they have been there. The nurse's testimony is the account of someone who has been there many times. It is offered in the hope that the hearing of it makes the being there when the time comes a little less frightening and a little more genuinely possible to be present for. This is explored during Sleeping 31, The Visions, the Dying Report. Among the most consistently documented and the most philosophically rich dimensions of the dying experience that the hospice nurse observes is the phenomenon of the visions and the communications that the dying person reports in the days and weeks before the death, the visits from the deceased, the conversations with people who are not visible to the family in the room, the descriptions of places and presences that the dying person encounters in the state between waking and sleep that the dying process increasingly produces. These experiences are reported by a substantial proportion of dying people across cultural backgrounds and religious beliefs, and the nurses who attend the dying regularly describe them as one of the most consistent and the most moving features of the final period. The dying person who reports seeing a deceased parent or a long-dead friend at the bedside, who speaks to them, who describes them with a vividness and a specificity that the family finds both moving and unsettling, is not, in the nurse's assessment of the phenomenon, experiencing a sign of cognitive decline or a side effect of medication in the simple sense that the clinical model tends to offer as the explanation. The nurse who has attended many dying people and who has heard many accounts of these experiences carries a more nuanced relationship to their meaning, not the claim that the experiences are literally what they appear to be, but the observation that they consistently produce in the dying person a quality of comfort and reassurance that no clinical intervention provides in the same form. Dying person who has been visited by the deceased parent and who reports that the parent said it was going to be all right tends to be, in the nurse's observation, a dying person who is less frightened and more settled than the dying person who has not had such a visit. Whether the visit is the literal visitation of the deceased or the dying brain's final act of self-comfort is a question the nurse leaves open. What the nurse observes is the effect, and the effect is consistently toward peace. The family that receives the report of the vision with skepticism or concern is missing the more important information. The dying person is being comforted. The source of the comfort matters less than the comfort itself. 32. The family that takes over. The hospice nurse who has worked in end-of-life care encounters, with regularity, a specific family dynamic that is one of the most difficult to navigate and one of the most consistently harmful to the dying person's experience of the final period. The family that takes over the dying person's care in a way that removes the dying person from the center of their own dying. The family whose grief and whose love, and whose need to do something in conditions where the doing of things is largely not what is needed, produces a room in which the dying person is surrounded by activity and management and decision-making from which they themselves have been subtly removed, in which the dying is being handled by the family rather than inhabited by the person who is doing it. The removal is not intentional. The family that takes over is almost always acting from genuine love and genuine distress, from the specific need to feel useful in conditions where the useful is not primarily available in the forms they know how to provide. The management of the practical details, the coordination of the medical team, the organization of the visiting schedule, these are things that can be done, and the family that needs to be doing something does them, and the doing of them can, if it expands to fill the available space, produce a dying period in which the dying person's own experience and the dying person's own wishes and the dying person's own relationship to what is happening are secondary to the family's management of it. The nurse who observes this dynamic navigates it with the care that the love behind it deserves, and with the consistent redirection toward the same question: what does the dying person want? Not what does the family think the dying person needs. What does the dying person want? The dying person's wishes for the final period are the primary data. The family's needs and the family's grief are real and they require attention, but they are not the primary data. The hospice nurse is there for the dying person. The dying person's experience of the dying is what the nurse is organized around. The family's management, when it displaces the dying person from the center of their own dying, is one of the things the nurse is there to gently and consistently redirect. 33. What the nurse has learned about forgiveness. The hospice nurse's understanding of forgiveness, accumulated from the years of witnessing the forgiveness that was given and the forgiveness that was not, the conversations that released long-held grievances and the conversations that failed to happen before the window closed, is one of the most practically urgent dimensions of the testimony. Urgent because the window for the giving and the receiving of forgiveness is the window of the dying person's life. And the closure of that window is something the nurse observes with a regularity that gives the urgency its genuine weight. The forgiveness that the nurse observes being most healing at the bedside is not always the dramatic reconciliation of the long estranged. Sometimes it is. The family member who arrives after years of distance and who sits at the bedside and says, "I forgive you" or "I am sorry," and who watches the dying person's face change in the receiving of those words, is a scene the nurse has witnessed and that they carry as evidence of the genuine power of the spoken word in the conditions of the final period. But the forgiveness that the nurse observes being equally important and less commonly discussed is the smaller, quieter forgiveness, the acknowledgement of the ordinary accumulated hurts of the ordinary family life, the things that were said and were not said across the years of the relationship, that the final period creates the conditions for releasing. What the nurse most wants people to understand about forgiveness in the context of the dying period is that it is not required to be complete or philosophically perfect to be effective. The dying person who hears "I am sorry" and "I loved you" and "I forgive you" receives something real from those words, regardless of the specific complexity of the history between the speaker and the listener. The words are not the resolution of everything. They are the acknowledgement that the relationship mattered more than the specific grievances accumulated within it. That acknowledgement, offered honestly in the conditions of the genuine final period, is one of the most consistently powerful things the nurse observes being received by the dying person. Say it, the imperfect version is better than the unsaid perfect one. 34. What the nurse does when alone with the dying. The hospice nurse who is alone with the dying person, in the intervals when the family has stepped away, in the hours of the night shift when the room is quiet, and the nurse is the only human presence, develops practices and habits that the professional training does not prescribe, and that the institutional environment does not always acknowledge, but that the nurse develops out of the genuine response to the genuine situation of being alone with someone who is in the process of leaving the world. The nurse speaks to the dying person, even when the person appears unconscious. Even when the medical assessment of the level of consciousness does not support the assumption that the words are being heard, the nurse speaks. They introduce themselves. They explain what they're doing when they adjust the medication or change the position or perform the care that the dying body requires. They tell the dying person what they observe about the dying person's comfort. They speak to the person rather than to the body, because the nurse's years of observation have produced the conviction that the speaking to the person is the correct relationship to maintain with the dying person, regardless of the state of consciousness. Some nurses pray, some play music, some simply sit with the person in a silence that is not the silence of the disengaged, but the silence of the genuinely present. What these practices share is the quality of the continued regard for the dying person as a person, the refusal to treat the dying body as the object of the clinical management rather than as the still inhabited location of the person who is in the process of leaving. The nurse who does this work at night, in the quiet of the room where the family is not present, is performing one of the most important and the most unacknowledged acts of care available. They are making sure that the dying person is not alone, not in the sense that their body is not alone, in the sense that is more important than that. 35. What nurses want doctors to know. The hospice nurse works within a medical system that has, as one of its organizing commitments, the extension of life through the application of the full range of the available clinical interventions, and the nurse's position at the threshold of the dying process places them in a relationship to that commitment that is sometimes complementary and sometimes genuinely in tension with it. The nurse who has watched the dying person undergo interventions that the nurse's assessment of the dying person's wishes and the dying person's comfort suggests were not serving the dying person, whose primary beneficiary was the system's commitment to the doing of everything that could be done rather than the dying person's experience of the being done to, carries a set of observations about what the medical system gets wrong in the management of the dying that the testimony of the hospice nurse most urgently wants to include. The first thing the nurse wants physicians to understand is that the conversation about dying needs to happen earlier. The physician who waits until the treatment options are genuinely exhausted before having the honest conversation about the prognosis and the dying process is the physician who is leaving the dying person and their family with the minimum available time for the preparation that the final period requires. The dying person who is told honestly and early that the disease will end their life has time to organize the ending, to say the things that need to be said, to make the decisions that need to be made, to be present in the final period with the quality of genuine presence that the unexpected and unprepared for death cannot produce. The conversation is hard. It is harder to have later. The second thing the nurse wants physicians to understand is that comfort is a legitimate goal of care, that the decision to focus the clinical management on the dying person's comfort rather than on the extension of the life is a decision that the physician can support or resist, and that the physician who resists it in the service of the commitment to the extension of life may be serving a value that the dying person does not share. The dying person's assessment of what they want from the remaining time is the primary data. The nurse is often the person at the bedside who knows what that assessment is. 36. The dying person's relationship with food. The hospice nurse's account of the dying person's changing relationship with food, the progressive withdrawal from eating and drinking that accompanies the dying process, and that the families of the dying person consistently find among the most emotionally difficult dimensions of the final period, is one of the most practically important pieces of testimony available from the bedside. Practically important because it addresses one of the most consistent sources of conflict between the family's instinct and the dying person's actual experience. The family's instinct is to feed. Food is care. Food is love. Food is the most immediate and the most available form of the nurturing that the family wants to provide, and that the conditions of the dying process are progressively making less available to provide through the ordinary means. The family that sits at the bedside with the bowl of the dying person's favorite soup, trying to encourage them to eat, is acting from genuine love and genuine distress. The nurse who understands that the dying person's withdrawal from food is not a failure of appetite in the ordinary sense, but a physiological component of the dying process, that the dying body has shifted from the maintenance of the living functions to the winding down of those functions, and that forcing the eating is working against the natural process, is in the position of having to communicate something that the love behind the bowl of soup makes genuinely difficult to receive. The nurse's message is not that the family should stop caring. It is that the caring in the conditions of the final period takes a different form than it has taken throughout the prior life of the relationship. The food was love in the ordinary conditions. In the final period, the presence is the love. The sitting with the dying person, the holding of the hand, the speaking of the genuine things, these are the form that the care takes when the eating has become a forcing rather than a feeding. The family that can make this transition, from the provision of food to the provision of presence, is making one of the most important adjustments the dying period requires. 37. Faith at the end of life. The hospice nurse, who has attended the deaths of people across the full spectrum of religious belief and religious unbelief, carries an observation about the role of faith in the dying process that is one of the most nuanced and the most carefully stated in the testimony. That the faith or the absence of faith that the dying person has carried through their life tends to be the faith or the absence that they carry through the dying process, and that the quality of the dying process is not reliably improved by the presence of faith in any formal sense, and is not reliably worsened by its absence. The dying person, who has been a person of genuine religious faith across the full span of their life, tends to approach the dying process with the framework that the faith provides. The understanding of the death as a transition, the expectation of what comes after, the comfort of the prayers and the rituals, and the community that the faith has always provided, and that it continues to provide in the conditions of the final period. This framework, when it is genuinely held, when the faith is the actual faith of the actual person, rather than the performed faith of the person who believes they are supposed to believe, tends to provide a quality of comfort that the nurse observes and values, without requiring the content of the faith to be the content they personally hold. The dying person, who has been a person of genuine secular conviction, who does not have the religious framework and who does not need it, tends to approach the dying process with the framework that their own understanding of the life and its ending provides. The completion, the having been here, the love that was given and received. This framework, when it is genuinely held, also provides a quality of peace that the nurse observes with the same respect. What the nurse most consistently observes serving the dying person badly is not the presence or the absence of faith, but the performance of either. The dying person who pretends to faith they do not have for the benefit of the family, or who pretends to a peace they have not found because the genuine distress is not permitted. 38. What nurses carry home. The hospice nurse does not leave the work at the workplace. The deaths that were most moving, the families that were most present, the dying people whose character or whose circumstances or whose particular quality of meeting the dying process the nurse found most remarkable, these are carried home, carried into the subsequent days and weeks, carried sometimes for years in the specific form of the specific memory that the work deposits in the nurse who did it with genuine attention and genuine care. The deaths that the nurse carries longest are not always the most dramatic ones. Sometimes they are the deaths of the ordinary person whose dying was characterized by a quality of grace or acceptance or love that the nurse found exceptional. The elderly man who spent his final hours describing the specific quality of the light on the river on the morning he proposed to his wife, and who died with a quality of completeness that the nurse found genuinely peaceful to witness. The middle-aged woman who used the final weeks to write letters to each of the people she loved, which she gave to the nurse to distribute after the death. The young person whose dying produced in the family and in the nurse a quality of presence and of genuine love that the ordinary life rarely produces. These are the deaths the nurse carries. The carrying is not only grief. The nurse who has done this work for years, and who is asked what the work has given them, describes the giving with a consistency that reflects genuine knowledge. The direct, permanent, experiential understanding that the ordinary life is genuinely good, that the ordinary Tuesday is genuinely worth being present for, that the people in the room are genuinely worth attending to, with the full quality of the available attention. The work at the threshold teaches, with a regularity and a directness that no other position provides, that the life is the thing, the life that is happening right now. The nurse goes home knowing this. 39. The family meeting, what it is really for. The family meeting that the hospice team convenes, the gathering of the family members around the table, with the medical team to discuss the situation and the prognosis and the plan of care, is understood by the families who participate in it primarily as an informational event. The occasion on which the medical team communicates the clinical facts, and the family receives them and asks questions, and reaches some collective understanding of the situation that allows the care to proceed. This understanding is accurate as far as it goes. The informational function of the family meeting is real, and it is important. But the hospice nurse who has participated in many family meetings, and who has observed what actually happens in the room, knows that the informational function is not the primary function. The primary function of the family meeting is relational. It is the occasion on which the family is gathered in the same room with each other, and with the medical team, often for the first time since the crisis began, and in which the different experiences and the different fears, and the different responses to the dying that the different family members have been managing in isolation from each other, become visible to each other and to the team. The sister who has been visiting every day, and who is exhausted by the vigil, and the brother who lives far away, and who has not been present, and who arrives at the meeting with a different assessment of the situation than the sister's experience has produced. These two people are in the same room. And the meeting is the occasion on which the team can see both of them, and can begin the work of addressing the full complexity of the family's situation, rather than only the medical complexity of the dying persons. The nurse who understands the family meeting in this fuller sense prepares for it differently than the nurse who understands it primarily as an information delivery event. They pay attention to who is in the room and who is not. They attend to the dynamics between the family members as much as to the questions about the medical situation. They hold the space for the feelings that the medical framing of the meeting does not always invite. The meeting is for the family as much as it is for the plan of care. The nurse who knows this is a different kind of presence in the room. 40. What we know at 40, the view deepens. We stand at the 40th entry, and the testimony of the hospice nurse has by now moved beyond the most immediately accessible observations about the dying process, and into the deeper and more nuanced dimensions of what the years of the work at the threshold produce in the nurses who do it with genuine attention. In the last 10 entries, we receive some of the most important and the most practically significant pieces of the testimony, the account of the visions the dying report, and the quality of peace they consistently produce, the family that takes over and the nurse's consistent redirection toward the dying person's own wishes, the understanding of forgiveness that the bedside produces, the practices the nurse develops when alone with the dying. What nurses want physicians to understand about the conversation that needs to happen earlier, the dying person's relationship with food, and what the family's response to it reveals about the form that love takes in the final period, the honest account of faith and its absence, what the nurse carries home, and the fuller understanding of what the family meeting is actually for. What these 40 entries have established is the essential character of the hospice nurse's position, not the clinical manager of the dying process, but the human presence at the threshold, the witness to the full range of what the dying produces in the people who are doing it and the people who love them, and the possessor of the understanding that only the years of that witness can produce. The testimony continues. This is explored during sleeping. 41. How the dying person experiences time. The dying person's experience of time in the final weeks and days is one of the dimensions of the dying process that the hospice nurse observes most clearly, and that the family tends to find most difficult to adjust to, because the dying person's relationship to time becomes, as the dying process advances, genuinely different from the relationship to time that the living person maintains and that the family is still operating within. The dying person in the final weeks tends to inhabit a time that is organized around the present moment rather than around the future. The living person's experience of time is primarily oriented forward, organized around the plans, the appointments, the anticipated events that give the structure of the coming days and weeks their shape. The dying person's orientation toward the future is progressively withdrawn by the dying process itself, which removes the anticipated events from the future and leaves the present moment as the primary temporal location. The dying person tends to be where they are in a way that the living person, organized around what is coming, is not entirely where they are. The nurse who has observed this quality in the dying person describes it not as a deprivation, but as the dying process's specific gift, the specific capacity for the present moment that the living person's orientation toward the future consistently prevents. The dying person who has stopped planning for the future because there is no future to plan for, and who is therefore entirely and completely in the current day, and the current conversation, and the current quality of the afternoon light in the room, is experiencing the present moment with a completeness that the living person's habitual future orientation makes genuinely difficult to access. The nurse who has observed this and who returns from the work of the day to the ordinary life of the ordinary evening carries it as one of the most consistent reminders the work provides. The present is the location of the life. The dying person is teaching this from the far end of the experience. 42. The immediate aftermath. What families need to know. The hours immediately following the death, the period between the moment the death is confirmed and the moment the body is taken from the room, are a period that the hospice nurse wants families to know they are not required to hurry through. The cultural expectation that the death is an event that triggers an immediate sequence of practical actions, the calling of the funeral home, the notification of the relevant parties, the efficient management of the logistics of the death, can produce in the family a quality of the immediate aftermath that the nurse observes as unnecessary and in some cases harmful to the family's experience of the transition from the presence of the dying person to the presence of the person who has died. The nurse wants families to know that the body does not need to be removed immediately. The hours following the death can be hours of genuine presence with the person who has died, the sitting with them, the speaking to them, the allowing the family members who were not present at the moment of the death to arrive and to be with the person before the body is taken. These hours, which the hospice nurse consistently observes families moving through more slowly and more deliberately when they know they are available, produce a quality of transition from the death to the grief that the rushed version does not provide. The ritual of the washing and the dressing, performed by the family themselves rather than by the funeral home, in the traditions and the cultures where this is practiced, is described by the families who have performed it as one of the most meaningful and the most healing acts available in the immediate aftermath. An act of care for the person who can no longer care for themselves that completes the relationship of care that the dying period has organized. The nurse who supports families in this practice and who observes the quality of the transition it produces describes it as one of the things they most want more families to know is available to them if they want it. The body does not need to go yet. You can stay with it. You can take the time. 43. The Advance Directive, what it actually does. The Advance Directive, the document in which the person records their wishes about the medical interventions they want and do not want in the conditions of the final period, is, in the hospice nurse's experience of its presence and its absence, one of the most practically important documents a person can create and one of the most consistently undercreated. For reasons that the nurse understands, but that the understanding does not make less consequential in the conditions where the absence of the document produces the most harm. The Advance Directive does not primarily protect the dying person from unwanted medical interventions, though it does this too, and the protection is real and important. What the nurse observes the Advance Directive most reliably doing is something equally important and less commonly discussed. It protects the family from the impossible position of having to make decisions about the dying person's care without knowing what the dying person would have wanted. The family that does not have the Advance Directive is the family that is required, in the conditions of the dying person's incapacity, to make the decisions that the dying person would have been better positioned to make, decisions that the family makes under the conditions of their own grief and their own fears and their own complex and sometimes conflicting assessments of what the dying person would have wanted, without the guidance that the dying person could have provided and did not provide. The nurse has watched families be destroyed by this position, not destroyed by the death, but by the specific weight of the decision that was required of them in the absence of the dying person's own expressed wish. The guilt of the decision made without certainty, the conflict between family members whose assessments of the dying person's wishes differed, the permanent carrying of the question of whether the right thing was done, these are the specific harms that the Advance Directive prevents. Create the document. Have the conversation with the people who will be in the room. The conversation is hard, the absence of it is harder. 44. When everything is in place. The hospice nurse who has attended the deaths of many people and who has observed the full range of the conditions in which those deaths occurred, carries a clear sense of the difference between the dying period, when certain things are in place, and the dying period when they are not, and the difference is not primarily clinical. The clinical management of the dying process is, in the hospice setting, consistently good. What varies is the human dimension, and the human dimension is what the nurse observes producing the most significant differences in the quality of the dying person's experience of the final period and the family's experience of the surviving of it. When everything is in place, when the family has been honest with each other and with the dying person about what is happening, when the things that needed to be said have been said, when the advance directive exists and is being honored, when the family is present in the full sense rather than the managed sense, when the dying person's wishes are known and are being centered rather than the family's needs. The dying period has a quality that the nurse describes with a consistency that makes it recognizable as a pattern rather than an exception. It is quieter. It is more genuinely inhabited by everyone in the room. The dying person tends to be more peaceful and the family tends to be less frantic, and the specific quality of the time together in the final period, however long or short that period is, tends to be the quality that the family carries afterward as the thing they are most grateful for. The nurse offers this not as the counsel of perfection, but as the counsel of the possible, that the things which most reliably produce the better quality of the dying period are available to most families in most circumstances, and that the preparation for them, the honest conversation, the expressed wishes, the genuine presence, is more available earlier than it tends to feel from the position of the family that has not yet started. 45. The unexpected humor. The hospice nurse's account of the role of humor in the dying period is one of the most surprising and the most important dimensions of the testimony for the person who approaches the dying period with the expectation that it will be uniformly grave. The dying period in the nurse's direct observation contains humor, genuine, spontaneous. Often irreverent humor, in a proportion that the cultural expectation of the solemn deathbed does not predict, and that the families who have not been to a hospice bedside before consistently find disorienting until they find it liberating. The dying person who makes jokes about the indignities of the dying process, whose humor about the specific awkwardness of the body that is no longer doing what it used to do, provides a quality of relief for everyone in the room that the serious conversation cannot provide, is performing one of the most important human acts available in the conditions of the final period. The act of maintaining the full humanity of the experience, of refusing the reduction of the dying period to its most solemn dimensions, of demonstrating that the person who is dying is still the person who has always been, with the same sense of humor and the same relationship to the absurdity of the human situation that they had throughout the prior life. The nurse who has been present at these moments of genuine laughter in the hospice room describes them as among the most moving experiences of the work, more moving, in some ways, than the solemn moments, because the laughter confirms what the solemn moments can sometimes obscure. That the person who is dying is fully alive until they are not, that the full range of the human experience is available in the conditions of the dying just as it was available in the conditions of the living, and that the full range includes the specific relief, and the specific connection, and the specific humanity of the genuine laugh at the genuine situation. The dying person who made the nurses laugh was not avoiding the death, they were inhabiting it completely. 46. What the dying person teaches the nurse. The hospice nurse who has done the work for years, and who is asked what the work has taught them returns, with consistency, to the same essential answer, that the dying people they have attended have taught them more about how to live than any other source of instruction available in the ordinary life. This is not a sentimental claim. It is the honest account of the effect of the repeated exposure to the end of the life on the person who is still in the middle of it. The effect of the consistent, direct, genuine encounter with the dying person's relationship to what is most important. The dying person who is no longer managing their social presentation, who is no longer organizing their communication around the anticipated responses of the audience, who is no longer deferring the expression of what is genuinely felt to a more convenient future moment. This dying person is, in the nurse's observation, frequently the most honest and the most direct communicator that the nurse has encountered in any professional or personal context. The dying strips away the performance. What remains in the person who has been stripped is the actual person. And the actual person, in the nurse's consistent experience of the actual people they have attended, tends to be more interesting, more loving, more genuinely human than the performed version that the ordinary conditions of the ordinary life required them to present. The nurse who goes home from the work carrying what the dying person most recently taught them carries a very specific kind of instruction. The instruction of the person who has seen the full arc and who is pointing from the far end of it at what mattered. Not pointing with words, necessarily, sometimes with the quality of the presence, with the specific attention they give to the remaining things, with the face that they turn toward the window or toward the person who is in the room. The nurse learns to read these pointings, And what they point toward, consistently and across the enormous variety of individual people and individual lives, is the same direction: the people, the present, the love. 47. The sibling dynamics that emerge. The hospice nurse who has worked with families through the dying period of a parent observes, with a regularity that makes it one of the most consistent patterns in the work, the emergence or the re-emergence of the sibling dynamics of the family of origin, the specific hierarchies and competitions and alliances and old wounds and unresolved conflicts that the family of origin produced, and that the adult lives of the siblings have, in many cases, been organizing around the avoidance of for decades. The dying of the parent is the occasion on which the avoidance becomes impossible, because the siblings are required to be in the same room, making decisions that affect all of them, in the conditions of the shared grief that makes all of them more emotionally raw than the ordinary adult life generally produces. The nurse does not observe this with judgment. The sibling dynamics that emerge in the dying period are not the product of bad character. They are the product of the genuine complexity of the family history, meeting the genuine pressure of the genuine emergency, in conditions that are genuinely difficult for everyone in the room. The sibling who seems to be obstructing the process is, in most cases, a person who is frightened and grieving, and who is managing their fear and their grief in the specific way that their specific history has equipped them to manage it. Understanding this does not make the obstruction less difficult to navigate. It makes the navigation more patient. The nurse who has navigated these dynamics for years carries a piece of counsel for the families who find themselves in the sibling conflict during the dying period. The conflict is not primarily about the dying person's care, even when it presents as a conflict about the dying person's care. It is primarily about the siblings' grief and the siblings' relationships with each other and with the dying parent. Addressing the conflict as if it were only about the care tends to make it worse. Addressing it as what it actually is, the grief of several different people who love the same person in different ways and who are losing that person in the conditions of their shared history, tends to make it more navigable. 48. The first hours of grief. The hospice nurse who has been present at the death and who stays with the family in the immediate hours following it observes the first hours of the grief with the specific attention of the person who has been present at many first hours and who knows something about what the family in the immediate aftermath of the death most needs and least needs from the people around them. What the family most needs in the first hours is the simplest and the most difficult to provide: genuine presence without agenda. The person who sits with the family in the first hours and who does not need anything from the family, not the performance of the composed grief, not the resolution of the practical arrangements, not the reassurance that they are managing adequately, but who is simply there in the room as the human witness to the first hours of the transition from the life with the person to the life after them, provides something that the nurse consistently observes making a genuine difference. What the family least needs in the first hours is the premature comfort, the rush to reframe the loss, to find the silver lining, to remind the family that the person is no longer suffering or that they had a good long life. These things may be true. They are not what the first hours are for. The first hours are for the full weight of the loss to be present without the requirement that it be managed into something more comfortable. The nurse who has supported families through the first hours of the grief describes the appropriate response to the first hours as the response of the witness rather than the comforter. To be present, to be quiet, to allow the grief to be what it is in the immediate conditions of the just occurred, without the pressure to move through it toward the something better that will in time be available, but that the first hours have not yet earned. 49. The dying person who has not said goodbye. The dying person who has not been able to say goodbye to someone who matters, the estrangement that the dying has not resolved, the person who is not coming, the relationship whose ending preceded the dying and whose terms the dying has not changed, is one of the most delicate and the most consistently difficult situations in the hospice setting, and one that the nurse navigates with the care that the genuine complexity of the situation requires. The person from whom the dying person is estranged may know the dying person is dying and has chosen not to come, may not know, may be unknown in their current location, may be unreachable in the time that remains. Each of these situations requires a different response. And the nurse who is navigating the situation for the dying person, who is trying to ensure that the dying person's needs in relation to this specific unresolved relationship are addressed as fully as the circumstances allow, brings to the navigation the full care that the full human weight of the situation deserves. The nurse wants families who are observing this situation to understand that the resolution of the estrangement is not always possible, and that the impossibility of the resolution does not prevent the dying person from being cared for in relation to the grief of it. The dying person who cannot reach the estranged person can be helped to say, in the conditions of the room, what they would have said in the conditions of the meeting that did not occur. The nurse who facilitates this, who creates the conditions in which the dying person can say, to the person who is not present, the thing that the relationship most needs to have said, is performing one of the most important acts of care available in the conditions of the irresolvable. The saying is not the same as the hearing, but it is not nothing. 50. What we know at 50, the midpoint of the testimony. We stand at the midpoint of our journey through what hospice nurses most want people to know, and the portrait of the dying period that these 50 entries have assembled, drawn from the accumulated years of the nurses' direct observation of what actually happens at the threshold, has by now achieved the depth and the honesty of something that genuinely deserves to be received. In the last 10 entries, we receive some of the most practically significant and the most personally intimate pieces of the testimony, the dying person's altered relationship to time and what it produces in the person experiencing it, what families need to know about the immediate aftermath and the hours they are not required to rush through, the advance directive and what its absence costs the family, the conditions under which the dying period has its best quality, the unexpected humor that inhabits the room alongside the grief, what the dying person teaches the nurse about how to live, the sibling dynamics that the dying of the parent brings to the surface, the first hours of the grief and what they most need, the dying person who cannot say goodbye and the nurse's response to the irresolvable. What the 50 lessons here have established is the full human breadth of the dying period, not the clinical event but the human one, with all its complexity and all its humor and all its grief and all its unexpected grace. 50 entries remain. The testimony continues into the deeper dimensions of what the threshold teaches. This is explored during Sleeping 51, the partner at the bedside. The partner or spouse who sits at the bedside of the dying person, who has shared the daily life of the dying person across the years or the decades of the relationship, and who is now in the position of witnessing the ending of the person whose presence has been the primary constant of their own daily existence, is, in the hospice nurse's observation, the person in the room who is simultaneously the most present and the most invisible. Most present because they are the person the dying person most turns toward, the person whose hand is most consistently held, the person whose face is most consistently sought by the dying person across the hours of the final days. Most invisible because the institutional and the family attention tends to organize around the dying person's children or siblings or other relatives, and the partner's grief, which is in many cases the deepest and the most disrupting of any in the room, is sometimes the grief that receives the least formal acknowledgement. The nurse who has observed the partner at the bedside across many dying periods carries a specific attention toward the partner's experience that the family dynamics of the room do not always produce naturally. The partner who has been the primary caregiver across the months of the illness, who has been organizing their entire daily existence around the management of the dying person's care and comfort, is the person who will experience the death not only as a personal loss, but as the removal of the structure that has organized every day for the duration of the illness. The grief of the loss and the disorientation of the removed structure arrive simultaneously, and the combination is a specific kind of difficulty that the nurse wants the family to attend to in the period following the death. The nurse wants families to know that the partner needs specific care in the immediate period following the death, not only the abstract knowledge that support is available, but the practical, particular showing up care that the partner's own caregiving role during the illness may have obscured the family's habit of providing. The person who spent the last year caring for the dying person has not been taking care of themselves. They need help now. The grief is real and it is enormous. And they will need the people in the room to look at them and see it. 52. The dying person's unfinished business. The hospice nurse who has attended many dying people and who has listened to what those people most consistently speak about in the final weeks carries a clear understanding of the categories of the unfinished business that the dying person most commonly encounters, the practical and the relational and the existential dimensions of the things that were not completed, and that the approaching death is revealing as unfinished. The nurse who helps the dying person address this unfinished business is performing one of the most important and the most underappreciated functions of the hospice role. The practical unfinished business, the will not completed, the financial affairs not organized, the practical arrangements not communicated, is the dimension that the medical and the legal systems have the most established mechanisms for addressing, and the nurse who identifies the presence of this practical anxiety in the dying person can connect the dying person and the family with the people and the processes that address it. The dying person who is carrying the anxiety of the unresolved practical business is a dying person whose energy is being consumed by a solvable problem, and the solving of the solvable problem is one of the most straightforward contributions the hospice team can make to the quality of the dying person's final period. The relational unfinished business, the estrangement not resolved, the love not expressed, the apology not offered or not received, is the dimension that the nurse addresses with the most care and the most patience, because the relational unfinished business is not always solvable in the conventional sense, and because the nurse's role in relation to it is not to solve it, but to create the conditions in which the dying person can address what is addressable and to be genuinely present with what is not. The existential unfinished business, the question of whether the life was worth it, whether the person was good, whether the things they did mattered, is the dimension that the nurse addresses most quietly and most consistently, by being the witness who confirms, through the quality of their presence and their attention, that the person's life was worth attending to, which is a form of the answer to the question they most need. 53. The final 24 to 48 hours. The final 24 to 48 hours of the dying process, the period that the clinical literature calls the active dying phase, and that the hospice nurse recognizes by a constellation of observable changes that together signal the approach of the death, is the period that families most frequently report being unprepared for and most consistently wish they had understood better in advance. The nurse wants families to know what to expect in this period, not to prepare them for a clinical event, but to prepare them to be present in it, to understand what they are observing well enough to be able to be with it rather than being frightened by it. The changes that mark the active dying phase are real and they are observable, and they are not painful in the way that the family's observation of them tends to suggest. The breathing changes, the longer pauses between breaths, the changed rhythm, the sounds that the nurse recognizes as the dying process, and that the family, hearing them for the first time, sometimes mistakes for distress, are the body's natural adjustment to the withdrawal of the systems that maintain the living processes. The mottling of the skin, the specific pattern of the skin's culture change that the circulation's withdrawal produces, is the visual evidence of the body's prioritization of the core over the periphery, the cooling of the extremities, the profound stillness. These are the signs of the process completing itself. And the nurse who has observed them many times carries them as the ordinary vocabulary of the threshold that the family is encountering for the first time. The most important thing the nurse wants families to know about the final 24 to 48 hours is this: stay. If you are willing to be present at the moment of the death, and you are able to be present, stay. The active dying phase is the family's opportunity to be genuinely with the dying person in the conditions of the most complete honesty available, the conditions where nothing is being managed and nothing is being performed, and the only available thing is the genuine being together of the people who love each other in the last available hours of that love's specific form. Stay, hold the hand, speak. The nurse who has observed what the staying provides to the dying person and to the family that is doing it describes it as one of the most important things the dying period makes available. 54. The family secret that shadows the room. The hospice nurse who has worked with families through the dying period encounters, with a regularity that is striking and that the nurse learns to recognize, the presence of the unspoken secret, the piece of family history or the unacknowledged truth about the dying person or the relationship that everyone in the room knows and that no one names. And that sits in the room as a specific weight that the dying period is making harder to maintain, and that the dying person's approaching death is revealing as something that requires addressing before the opportunity for the addressing permanently closes. The secret takes many forms across the many families the nurse has attended. The family member whose relationship to the dying person was not what it was publicly described as being, the estrangement whose cause was never acknowledged among the people who observed its effects, the specific history between the dying person and one of the family members in the room that the dying period is bringing to the surface in ways that neither party has yet found the way to address. The nurse who observes the weight of the unspoken secret in the room does not always have the position or the relationship to address it directly. But the nurse who has created enough trust with the dying person, or with a member of the family to be told what the secret is, can sometimes create the conditions in which the addressing becomes possible. The nurse wants families to know that the dying period is the occasion for the addressing of the unspoken, if the unspoken requires addressing before the window closes. Not the forced addressing, not the therapeutic intervention that requires the dying person to process what they are not ready to process in the conditions of the final weeks. But the gentle, honest opening of the space in which the thing that has not been named can be named, if the naming is what the dying person needs, and if the naming is what the relationship between the dying person and the family requires for the dying person to leave well. The secret's maintenance costs something. The dying period is the occasion to ask whether the cost is still worth paying. 55. What the marriage looked like at the end. The hospice nurse who has attended many dying people and who has observed the full range of the marriages and the long-term partnerships that those dying people inhabited, carries an understanding of what the marriage looks like at the end, of what the decades of the shared life reveal about themselves in the conditions of the dying period. That is one of the most intimate and the most consistently moving pieces of testimony available from the bedside. The marriages that the nurse has observed at the dying period are not all the same. The marriage that was genuinely good, in which the two people genuinely knew and genuinely loved each other across the full arc of the years, tends to look in the dying period as it looked throughout. The hand-holding that is natural rather than performed, the communication that requires minimal words because the long shared history has produced a literacy of gesture and expression that substitutes for the verbal, the quality of presence in the one who is remaining that is organized entirely around the one who is leaving. These marriages, observed in the dying period, are among the most moving things the nurse observes in the course of the work. The marriages that were performed rather than genuinely inhabited, in which the presentation of the partnership was different from the interior experience of it, tend to look different in the dying period, because the dying period is one of the conditions that the performance has the most difficulty maintaining. The nurse who has observed the dying person turn away from the partner, who has observed the quality of the distance between the two people in the room, despite the long years of the official partnership, carries this observation not as a judgment, but as one of the most direct pieces of testimony available from the bedside about what the long life reveals at its end. The dying period is honest. It shows what was actually there. The marriages that had something actually there are visible in the dying period as something worth having been. The nurse who has witnessed this testifies to it as one of the most important things the work has shown them about how to inhabit the years that are still available. 56. When the dying person is young. The death of the young person, the death that arrives before the ordinary arc of the life, has had time to complete itself, that removes from the world a person whose future was still genuinely ahead of them, is the dimension of the hospice nurse's work that the nurses who describe it most consistently identify as the most difficult and the most permanently affecting. Not because the death of the young is the most painful death in the clinical sense, but because the death of the young carries a specific weight of unfinished that the death of the person at the end of the ordinary arc does not carry in the same form. The young person who is dying tends to grieve differently from the old person who is dying, tends to grieve the specific unlived things rather than the completed life. The children who will grow up without the parent who is dying, the relationship that is being cut short, the work that was in progress and will not be finished. The places not yet visited, the experiences not yet had, the version of the self that was still in the process of developing, and that the death is interrupting rather than completing. The specific shape of the young person's grief is the shape of the specific future that the death is removing, and the nurse who sits with the young dying person in the grief of that future must be prepared to be genuinely present with a loss that is different in kind from the loss of the long life completed. The families of the young dying person are in a different position from the families of the old dying person. The death of the parent or the grandparent at the end of the long life, however genuinely grieved, is the death that the natural order of the world has prepared the family for. The death of the child, the sibling, the young partner, this death is the one that the natural order did not prepare the family for, that arrives against the grain of what was expected and what felt right, and whose wrongness the family carries in a specific form that the nurse who attends the young dying person must hold with a care and a patience that matches the specific weight of what is being held. 57. The moment of peace. The hospice nurse who has attended many deaths carries an account of the moment of peace, the moment that the dying person arrives at in the final days or the final hours, that is different from the other moments of the dying period, and that the nurse recognizes by the quality of the dying person's face and the quality of the room in the moment of its occurring. This moment is not the moment of the death. It is the moment that precedes the death, and that seems, in the nurse's observation, to constitute a specific arrival, the arrival at the place from which the death is accessible rather than the struggle against it. The moment of peace is not always visible, and the nurse does not claim that it is universal. But it appears with enough consistency across the full range of the dying people. The nurse has attended to constitute one of the most consistent features of the dying process, and the families who witness it in the dying person they love describe it, in the accounts they give the nurse in the period following the death, as one of the things they are most grateful for having been present to see. The dying person whose face in the moment of the peace communicates something that the family can only describe as having arrived somewhere, whose expression conveys a quality of rest and completion that the prior days of the dying process did not contain, is giving the family a specific form of comfort that the nurse observes being received as genuinely reassuring, even in the conditions of the genuine grief. The nurse who has observed this moment many times carries it as one of the things the work at the threshold most reliably provides. The evidence, renewed across the years of the work, that the dying process does not always end in the distress that the fear of it predicts, that the arrival in many cases is genuinely peaceful, that the face of the dying person in the moment of the peace is not the face of suffering. The nurse wants the families who are approaching the final period to know this. The evidence is consistent, the peace is real. 58. The caregiver who became the family member who lost themselves. The family member who assumes the primary caregiver role for the dying person, the spouse, the adult child, the sibling who takes on the management of the care across the months or years of the illness, is, in the hospice nurse's observation, one of the most consistently overlooked people in the room, and one of the people most in need of the attention that the focus on the dying person tends to pull away from them. The caregiver has, in many cases, spent the duration of the illness organizing their entire life around the needs of the dying person, and the organization has required the consistent subordination of their own needs to the point where the needs themselves are no longer clearly visible. The nurse who has observed the primary caregiver across the dying period observes the accumulation of the cost of the caregiving in the specific ways that the cost presents itself. The exhaustion that is deeper than the ordinary exhaustion of a hard period, the social isolation of the person who has been home with the dying person and away from the ordinary social world for months or years, the specific grief of the caregiver who has been losing the person they love gradually across the duration of the illness, and who arrives at the moment of the death having already done a significant portion of the grieving in advance. The death, when it arrives, does not end the caregiver's difficulty. In some cases, it intensifies it, because the structure that the caregiving provided, the organizing of every day around the dying person's needs, is suddenly removed, and the structure's removal leaves a specific emptiness that is different from the ordinary grief. The nurse wants the families of primary caregivers to know that the caregiver needs specific care in the period following the death, the practical care, the social reintegration, the specific attention to the specific needs that the caregiving suppressed and that will, in the absence of the caregiving structure, need to be addressed. The caregiver gave the dying person everything. They will need the surviving family to give them something in return. 59. What nurses have learned about regret and control. The hospice nurse's observation of the regret that the dying person carries, the accumulated account of the things that were not done, not said, not pursued across the full span of the living years, is, as the testimony has already described, one of the most consistent findings from the bedside. What the nurse observes alongside the regret itself is a pattern in the things that generate the most enduring and the most difficult regret. The pattern of the regrets that are organized around the things the person did not do because they were afraid, because they were waiting for the right moment, because they were organizing the choices of the living years around the management of circumstances rather than the pursuit of what genuinely mattered. The regret of the managed life, the life that was organized primarily around the avoidance of the specific risks and the specific vulnerabilities that the genuine pursuit of the genuine things would have required, is the regret that the nurse observes most consistently in the dying person who did not live the life that they most genuinely wanted. Not the regret of the dramatic failure, not the regret of the specific mistake. Those regrets are present too, but they tend to carry a different quality. The regret of the managed life is the regret of the person who looks back across the full span of the years and understands, from the position of the end of it, that the management was the avoidance and that the avoidance was the cost. The nurse who observes this carries it as one of the most direct and the most urgently delivered pieces of counsel available from the bedside. The life that is being managed in the service of control is the life that is being protected from the exact risks that the genuine living requires. The dying person who regrets the management is the dying person who most clearly and most consistently directs the attention of the person at the bedside toward the thing that the living years are most worth spending on. The nurse goes home knowing this. They want the people who receive this testimony to know it too. 60. What we know at 60, the threshold in full. We stand at the 60th entry, and the testimony of the hospice nurses has now covered the full range of the dying period in its most significant human dimensions. From the clinical processes of the dying body to the relational complexities of the family in the room, from the moment of peace to the weight of the unspoken secret, from the young dying person to the old one at the end of the completed arc. In the last 10 entries, we receive some of the most personally intimate and the most practically significant pieces of the testimony, the account of the partner at the bedside and the specific invisibility of the deepest grief in the room, the dying person's unfinished business and the nurse's role in addressing it, the final 24 to 48 hours and what the family needs to know to be genuinely present for them. The family secret that shadows the room and the conditions under which it can be addressed. What the marriage looks like at the end. The death of the young person and the specific weight of the unfinished future. The moment of peace and its genuine reliability. The caregiver who lost themselves in the caregiving and what they need in the aftermath. The regret of the managed life and what it points toward. What the 60 entries assembled here have established is the full human breadth of the dying period, not the clinical event that the medical system tends to emphasize, but the human event that the hospice nurse witnesses from the position of the most continuous and the most honest presence in the room. 40 entries remain. The deepest testimony is ahead. This is explored during Sleeping 61, what the nurse knows about awareness in the final hours. The question of what the dying person is aware of in the final hours, what they experience, what they perceive, what the interior of the consciousness is like in the conditions of the active dying phase, is one of the questions that families most urgently want answered, and that the nurse is in the most honest position to address. Not because the nurse has certain knowledge of the dying person's interior experience, but because the nurse has the most direct observation of the external signs of that experience, and because the nurse's years of attending the final hours have produced a genuine understanding of what those signs suggest. What the nurse's observation most consistently suggests about the awareness of the dying person in the final hours is that the awareness is different from the ordinary waking consciousness in ways that make the ordinary measures of consciousness, the responsiveness to verbal communication, the orientation to person and place and time, inadequate as the full description of what is present. The dying person who is not responding to the verbal stimulus in the ordinary sense may be receiving the environment in a different mode, a mode that is more receptive than active, more interior than interactive, and that may be more richly inhabited than the external appearance of the closed eyes and the still face suggests to the family observing from outside it. The nurse who has observed the final hours many times carries the consistent observation that the dying person is somewhere, that the interior experience of the final hours is not the blank absence that the word unconscious tends to imply, and that the somewhere is not a frightening place in the way that the family's observation of the external signs might suggest. The dying person in the final hours, who occasionally moves the lips without audible words, who occasionally turns the face toward a sound or a presence, who occasionally produces an expression that the family cannot fully read, this dying person is in their own final experience, which the nurse's years of observation have given them reason to believe is more peaceful and more complete than the fear of dying predicted. 62. The gift of saying, "I don't know." The hospice nurse who has been asked by the dying person and by the family the questions that have no certain answers. What happens after the death, whether there is something beyond the dying, whether the person who is dying will experience anything in the moments and the period following the last breath, carries an understanding of how to hold these questions that is one of the most important and the most underappreciated dimensions of the nurse's skill. The answer that the nurse offers to these questions is not the reassurance that pretends to knowledge the nurse does not have. It is the honest acknowledgement of the genuine uncertainty, offered in a way that does not abandon the dying person to the uncertainty, but that accompanies them in it. The dying person who asks what happens next is not always asking for a theological or philosophical answer. They are often asking whether the asking is permitted, whether the uncertainty they feel is the correct response to their situation, whether the nurse who has been with many dying people has observed something that might bear on the question. The nurse who responds to this asking with the genuine honesty of the "I don't know, and here is what I have observed," is providing something that the reassurance that claims certainty cannot provide. The confirmation that the question is legitimate, that the uncertainty is honest, and that the nurse is willing to be in the uncertainty alongside the dying person rather than retreating from it into the comfort of the conventional answer. What the nurse has observed, the visions the dying report, the quality of the peace that arrives in the final hours, the specific quality of the moment of the death as the nurse has witnessed it many times, is offered not as the answer to the unanswerable question but as the testimony of the witness. This is what I have seen at the threshold from the position of having been there many times. The testimony does not resolve the question. It accompanies the person who is holding it. In the conditions of the final period, the accompanying is more important than the resolving. 63. The relationship between suffering and meaning. The hospice nurse who has attended the dying across many years carries an observation about the relationship between suffering and meaning in the dying period that is one of the most philosophically significant pieces of testimony available from the threshold. The observation that the suffering of the dying person is not uniform in its experience, and that the presence or the absence of meaning in the suffering, the dying person's sense of whether the dying is part of a larger story that makes the suffering comprehensible, is one of the most significant variables in the quality of the dying person's experience of the final period. The dying person who understands their dying as part of a meaningful narrative, the religious person for whom the dying is the completion of the arc that the faith has always described, or the person of any framework who understands their life as having been genuinely worth living and who understands the dying as its natural conclusion, tends to experience the suffering of the dying process differently from the dying person who has no framework within which the suffering makes sense. The suffering may be identical in its physical dimensions. Its experience is not identical in its psychological and existential dimensions. The meaning does not eliminate the suffering. It changes the dying person's relationship to it. The nurse who has observed this carries it as testimony rather than as prescription. Not the counsel that the dying person should find a framework they don't have, but the observation that the framework, when it is genuinely available, genuinely matters to the quality of the experience. And as the indirect counsel that the prior life's engagement with the questions of meaning, the genuine, not the performed engagement, tends to leave the person at the end of the life with more of the framework available than the life that deferred those questions in the service of the comfortable avoidance of them. The dying period is not the time to begin the genuine engagement with the questions of meaning. The dying period is the time to have the engagement that the prior life produced available when it is most needed. 64. The nurse's own presence. The hospice nurse who has developed genuine skill in the work at the threshold knows that the most important thing they bring to the bedside is not a clinical competence or an informational resource, but a quality of presence. A quality of genuine, unhurried, non-distracted attention to the dying person and to the family that communicates, without words and sometimes more effectively than words, that the dying person matters, that the dying is being witnessed by a person who takes it seriously. And that the dying person and the family are not alone in the most alone feeling experience available to the human being. This quality of presence is not taught in the nursing school curriculum in the form in which it appears at the bedside. It is developed through the years of the work at the threshold, through the accumulated experience of being genuinely present with the dying and the grieving, and of discovering, through that presence, what the genuine presence actually provides that the distracted or the managed version does not. The nurse who has learned genuine presence has learned it through the specific feedback that the dying person and the family consistently provide to the nurse who offers it. The relaxation of the tension in the room, the change in the dying person's face, the quality of the family member's response to being in the presence of the person who is genuinely there rather than professionally present. The nurse who understands their own presence as their primary clinical tool carries a different relationship to the bedside than the nurse who understands the clinical interventions as the primary offering. They organize their time at the bedside differently. They move differently in the room. They speak differently and are silent differently. And the families who have experienced the nurse whose presence was genuine, who felt in the nurse's being in the room something that they could not have asked for and that the nurse provided without being asked, describe the experience of that presence as one of the most significant things the hospice care provided. Not the medications, not the practical management, the person who was genuinely there. 65. The dying person who reviews their life. The hospice nurse who sits with the dying person in the final weeks carries a consistent opportunity to be the recipient of the life review, the narrative account of the life that the dying person produces in the conditions of the final period, when the approach of the death makes the life an object of genuine retrospective examination, rather than the ongoing experience that the living years did not require to be examined. The life review is not always explicitly named as such by the dying person. It tends to arrive as conversation, the telling of the stories, the return to the significant people and the significant events, the expression of the gratitude and the regret and the pride and the shame that the full account of the life contains. The nurse who listens to the life review is performing one of the most important acts of witness available in the final period. The act of receiving the account of the life as the evidence that the life mattered, that the events of it were real and significant and deserving of the genuine attention that the nurse is providing. The dying person who is given the opportunity to tell the story of their life to a genuinely attentive listener, who is not managing the story or redirecting it toward more comfortable territory or performing the appropriate responses rather than the genuine ones, experiences the telling as a form of completion. The life, reviewed in the presence of a genuine witness, becomes more fully its own. The nurse who has received many life reviews carries an archive of the testimony of many lives. And what the archive most consistently reveals is the same thing that the testimony of the elderly and the soldiers and the people who lost everything and rebuilt has revealed across the full range of this account, that the lives people most fully inhabited, the lives most genuinely organized around the genuine things, are the lives the dying person reviews with the most completeness and the least unfinished quality. The lives that were managed rather than inhabited are reviewed with the more familiar regret. The nurse who knows this goes home knowing what to do with the day. 66. What nurses want families to stop doing. The hospice nurse who has worked with families through the dying period accumulates, alongside the understanding of what helps, an equally clear understanding of what does not help, the behaviors that families engage in with genuine love and genuine good intention, and that consistently produce the opposite of their intended effect in the dying person's experience of the final period. The nurse who names these behaviors does so with the care that the love behind them deserves, and with the knowledge that the families engaging in them are not acting badly, but acting from the particular combination of grief and helplessness and cultural expectation that the dying period reliably produces. The first behavior the nurse most wants families to stop is the whispered conversation at the bedside, in which the family discusses the dying person, as though the dying person cannot hear or understand. The clinical update relayed in a low voice that is still audible to the dying person. The discussion of the practical arrangements for after the death conducted in the room where the person who is dying is still present. The nurse has already addressed the persistence of hearing in the apparently unconscious person. The behavior of the whispered conversation compounds the damage of the assumption. It removes the dying person from the room in which they are still physically present and treats them as though they have already become the object of the discussion rather than its subject. The second behavior the nurse most wants families to stop is the filling of every silence. The silence at the bedside is not the silence of discomfort that the ordinary social life requires to be filled. It is the silence of genuine presence, and the silence is something the dying person can inhabit. The family member who fills every silence with speech, who keeps the conversational volume high, who maintains a continuous verbal presence that does not allow the dying person the specific quality of the quiet, may be protecting themselves from the discomfort of the genuine silence rather than providing the dying person with what the dying person needs. The nurse wants families to know that the silence at the bedside is appropriate, and that the dying person is in it, and that the being in it together is one of the most genuine forms of presence available. 67. The comfort of the familiar routine. The hospice nurse who observes the dying person across the final weeks consistently notes the comfort that the familiar daily routine provides to the dying person whose world has been progressively reduced by the dying process. As the illness advances and the dying person's capacity for the activities and the social engagements of the prior life diminishes, the remaining elements of the familiar routine, the morning ritual, the familiar program, the habitual sequence of the small daily acts that have organized the days across the years, take on an importance and a comfort that their ordinariness in the prior life did not suggest they would have in the final period. The dying person who is bathed at the same hour and in the same manner as they have always bathed, who hears the morning news at the hour they have always heard it, who eats the food they have always eaten in the order they have always eaten it. This dying person is receiving, in the familiar routine's continuation, the evidence that the world is still organized in the ways that their life organized it, that the daily pattern of the prior existence is still present and still reliable, and that the dying process, for all that it has altered and removed, has not entirely disrupted the daily fabric of the existence. This evidence matters. It is received in the nurse's observation with a quality of comfort that the more dramatic interventions of the medical management do not reliably produce. The nurse who wants families to maintain the familiar routine in the dying period wants them to understand that the maintenance is not trivial. The cup of tea made the right way, brought at the right time, placed on the right surface, this is not a small act in the conditions of the dying period. It is the continuation of the evidence that the world is still the world, offered in the form that the dying person has received it across the years of the life that is ending. The familiar is the deepest comfort available when everything else has changed. 68. What the hospice environment provides. The hospice environment, whether the dedicated inpatient hospice facility or the home hospice program that brings the hospice care to the dying person's own home, provides something that the acute care hospital environment is structurally unable to provide: the organization of the care around the dying person's experience of the dying, rather than around the institution's management of the dying as a medical event. This difference in the organizing principle produces differences in the quality of the dying person's final period that the nurse observes with a consistency that makes the difference one of the most important recommendations available from the testimony. The hospital is organized around the treatment of illness and the extension of life. Its spaces, its rhythms, its protocols, its staffing, and its standards of care are all organized around the assumption that the patient is there to be treated and that the goal of the treatment is the continuation of the life. The dying person in the hospital is in the wrong institution, not because the institution is bad, but because the institution's organizing assumption does not match the dying person's situation, and the mismatch produces a dying period that is organized around the institution's goals rather than the dying person's. The hospice environment is organized around the dying person's experience of the dying, around the comfort, the dignity, the presence of the people they love, the management of the specific symptoms that diminish the quality of the remaining life, and the honest support of the dying person and the family through the dying process. The nurse who has worked in both environments describes the difference not as a difference of competence, but as a difference of purpose, and the difference of purpose produces a difference in the quality of the dying period that the nurse observes every day. The hospice environment is the right environment for the dying person. The nurse who carries this testimony wants every dying person to have access to it. 69. The dying person's dignity. The hospice nurse's understanding of dignity at the end of life, of what the dying person's dignity actually consists of, and what the maintenance of it actually requires, is one of the most practically important pieces of testimony available from the bedside, because the word dignity tends to be used in the dying period in ways that do not always reflect the dying person's actual wishes, and that sometimes reflect the family's or the institution's wishes more accurately than the dying person's. The dying person's dignity is not primarily the dignity of the maintained appearance, the specific cultural or social presentation that the prior life has associated with the person. The dying person whose body has changed in the ways the dying process changes it is not degraded by those changes unless the people caring for them communicate that the changes are degrading through the specific quality of the care they provide and the specific quality of the attention they bring to the dying person's body. The nurse who cares for the dying body with the same respect and the same attentiveness that would be appropriate for any body that is being cared for, who speaks to the dying person while providing the care, who handles the body with the gentleness that communicates that the body is the location of a person who matters, is maintaining the dignity of the dying person not by managing the appearance, but by confirming through the quality of the care that the person is still worthy of the full human regard. The dying person's dignity is also the dignity of the honored wish, the wish about the environment, the visitors, the medical interventions, the specific manner of the dying. The dying person who has expressed their wishes clearly and who observes those wishes being honored is receiving the most fundamental form of dignity available in the dying period. The acknowledgement that their wishes about their own dying are the primary data, that the dying is their own, and that the people caring for them are organized around the serving of that ownership. 70. What we know at 70, the deep witness. We stand at the 70th entry, and the testimony of the hospice nurse has now moved into the deepest and the most personally intimate dimensions of the work at the threshold. The dimensions that are not primarily clinical and not primarily practical, but that are the essential human content of what the years of the genuine presence at the bedside produce in the nurse who has given that presence honestly. In the last 10 entries, we received the nurse's honest account of the dying person's awareness in the final hours and the quality of the somewhere that the nurse observes the dying person to be in. We received the gift of the honest I don't know and what it provides that the reassurance cannot. We heard the observation about suffering and meaning and the framework that makes the suffering more navigable. We received the account of the nurse's own presence as the primary clinical tool. We heard what the dying person's life review reveals about what the life most richly inhabited looks like from the end of it. We received the specific behaviors the nurse wants families to stop. We understood the comfort of the familiar routine. We heard what the hospice environment provides that the hospital cannot. And we received the honest account of what dignity actually means in the conditions of the dying period. 30 entries remain. They carry the final dimensions of the testimony, the things that the threshold most urgently needs to say to the people who are still on the living side of it. The testimony is nearly complete. This is explored during sleeping. 71. The long arc of grief. The hospice nurse's understanding of grief, accumulated not only from the work at the bedside, but from the follow-up care that the hospice program provides to the families of the dying in the months following the death, is one of the most practically important dimensions of the testimony, because it addresses the experience that the family is left with when the nurse's presence at the bedside is concluded, and when the family must begin the long work of the living with the absence. The first thing the nurse wants families to know about grief is that it is not linear, and that the non-linearity is not a malfunction. The family that expects the grief to follow the prescribed stages, to move in an orderly progression from the shock of the loss toward the resolved acceptance of the loss, will experience the actual grief's nonlinearity as a failure of the recovery rather than as the honest character of the process. The grief that circles back, that produces good weeks followed by terrible weeks, that recedes and returns with a freshness that the passage of time should have diminished, but has not, this grief is doing what grief does. It is not doing it wrong. The second thing the nurse wants families to know is that the anniversary and the ordinary moments and the unexpected sensory encounter with the absent person's presence, the smell, the song, the specific light at a specific hour, tend to carry the grief forward in ways that the family does not always anticipate, and that the surrounding culture, which has a limited tolerance for the duration of visible grief, does not always adequately support. The person who is still visibly grieving a year after the death is not doing it wrong. They are doing it honestly. The nurse who has supported families through the long arc of the grief observes that the families who are given the permission to grieve the full duration of the grief, rather than the socially prescribed period, tend to arrive at the integration of the loss with less of the complicated grief that the suppression of the honest mourning consistently produces. 72. The dying person and their pets. The hospice nurse who has attended dying people across the full range of the individual circumstances of the individual lives consistently observes the relationship between the dying person and their animals as one of the most genuinely comforting and the most consistently underestimated sources of comfort available in the final period. The pet that has been the companion of the daily life, the dog that has slept at the foot of the bed, the cat that has occupied the specific chair in the specific room, provides in the dying period a quality of uncomplicated, non-demanding presence that the human relationships, however loving, cannot always provide with the same consistency. The animal does not grieve in advance. It does not perform the management of its distress for the benefit of the dying person. It does not need the dying person to be reassuring about the dying. It is simply present, in the same way it has always been present, with the specific warmth and the specific weight and the specific breathing that the dying person has known across the years of the relationship. This continuity, the animal's unchanged presence in the conditions where everything else has changed, is something the dying person receives with the quality of gratitude that the nurse observes across many bedsides and across many different relationships between the dying person and the animal that has been their companion. The nurse who knows this carries a practical counsel for families navigating the dying period in institutional settings, where the facility and the circumstances permit. Bring the animal. The visit of the dog, the presence of the cat, these are not trivial provisions. They are the provision of the specific kind of comfort that no human presence can fully replicate in the conditions where the comfort is most needed. The dying person who is visited by their animal in the final period receives a communication that exceeds what the words of the most loving person in the room can provide. The confirmation that the specific ordinary daily love of the specific creature was real, and that it is still there, and that the world the dying person is leaving still contains it. 73. The cultural dimensions of dying. The hospice nurse who has worked with families from the full range of cultural backgrounds that a diverse society produces carries an understanding of the cultural dimensions of dying that is one of the most practically important dimensions of the professional skill. The understanding that the dying process is not a universal event in the sense of being experienced and interpreted and managed in the same way across every cultural tradition. And that the nurse who brings only their own cultural framework to the bedside is bringing an inadequate framework. The cultural differences in the experience of dying are real and they are significant. The understanding of what the death means, whether it is an ending or a transition, whether it should be greeted with mourning or with celebration, whether the presence of the dying person's body after the death is the presence of a sacred thing or an empty vessel, varies across cultural traditions in ways that have profound practical implications for the care that the nurse provides and for the family's experience of the dying period. The nurse who understands these differences, who approaches the family with a genuine curiosity about what the dying means in the specific cultural tradition of the specific family, rather than the assumption that the general hospice framework applies without modification, is the nurse who can provide care that is genuinely responsive to the dying person's experience rather than to the hospice institution's default. The cultural dimensions that most consistently require the nurse's attention are the dimensions of the expression of grief, the cultures where the open, loud, physical expression of grief is the appropriate and the expected response to the death, and the cultures where the composed and managed expression is the appropriate response, and the dimensions of the family's role in the dying person's care. The cultures where the involvement of the extended family in the physical care of the dying person is both expected and sacred, and the cultures where the professional care is understood as the appropriate primary provision. The nurse who knows which of these frameworks the family is operating within is the nurse who can be genuinely useful in the room, rather than inadvertently working against the family's deepest needs. 74. The death that changed the nurse. Every hospice nurse who has done the work for years carries, in the specific archive of the deaths they have attended, one or several deaths that changed them, deaths whose impact on the nurse's own understanding of the world and of the life and of the work was sufficient to constitute a genuine alteration of the person who witnessed them. These deaths are not always the most dramatic ones. They are the ones that arrived in the nurse's specific interior at the specific moment when the nurse was most available to be altered by what they witnessed. The nurse who describes the death that changed them describes it not with the language of the professional assessment, but with the language of the personal. This specific person, in these specific circumstances, with these specific qualities of character or courage or love or honesty or grace, produced in me a response that the years of the work had not produced in the same form. The response may have been the deepest grief the nurse had felt in the work, or the deepest peace, or the specific quality of wonder that the dying person's approach to the death generated in the person witnessing it. Whatever the specific quality, the death that changed the nurse is the death that confirmed for the nurse why the work is worth doing. The specific embodied confirmation that the work at the threshold is the work of the most important human dimension, the dimension of the genuine human meeting at the moment of the highest possible stakes. The nurse who carries the memory of the death that changed them carries it as the testimony that justifies the weight of the work, as the evidence that the years of the accumulated grief and the accumulated presence in the conditions of the hardest human experience were producing, in the nurse and through the nurse in the families they attended, something genuinely important. The deaths that changed them are the deaths they would not undo. They are the deaths that made them the nurses they became. 75. What people pray for at the end. The hospice nurse who has been present at the prayers that the dying person and the family offer in the final period, who has heard the words and observed the quality of the prayer across the enormous variety of religious traditions and personal belief systems that the dying people the nurse has attended represent, carries an observation about what people actually pray for at the end of the life that is one of the most honest and the most practically useful pieces of testimony available from the bedside. What people pray for at the end is not primarily what they prayed for in the middle of the life. The middle of the life's prayers tended to organize around the petitions, the specific requests for the specific outcomes, the asking for the health or the prosperity or the resolution of the specific problem. The prayers of the final period tend to organize differently. They tend to organize around presence and around gratitude and around the acknowledgement of the love rather than around the petition for the specific outcome. The dying person who prays in the final period tends to be praying not for the continuation of the life, but for the peaceful conclusion of it, and for the well-being of the specific people who are being left behind. The observation that the nurse carries about the prayers of the final period is the observation about what the dying period reveals as the actual content of the human being's relationship to whatever larger reality the prayer is directed toward. In the conditions of the final period, the prayer is not the petition, it is the acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of the love that was received and the love that was given, the acknowledgement of the specific gratitude for the specific life and the specific people in it, and the specific, simple, urgently felt acknowledgement that the dying person was here, that it mattered, and that the mattering deserves to be spoken aloud in the presence of whatever is listening. The nurse who hears this prayer regularly carries it as one of the most moving testimonies available from the threshold about what the human being is, in the conditions of the most honest experience of their own existence. 76. The question the dying person most often asks. The hospice nurse who has sat with many dying people across the full range of the individual circumstances and the individual characters that the dying person brings to the final period carries an understanding of the question that arises most consistently, the question that appears in various formulations and at various points in the dying period, more frequently than any other single question. The question is not about the dying process. It is not about the medical management. It is not about what comes after the death. The question that the dying person most often asks is the question of whether their life mattered. The formulations vary. Did I do enough? Was I a good person? Will people remember me? Did I make a difference? Did the people I loved know that I loved them? These are all versions of the same fundamental question, the question of the significance of the life, the question of whether the decades of the living produced something worth having produced, whether the person's presence in the world left it in some way different from what it would have been without them. The question arrives in the conditions where the life can be seen in something close to its full extent, when the prior urgency of the living has been replaced by the specific clarity of the ending, and when the honest assessment of the life is more available than it has been at any prior point. The nurse who receives this question consistently carries a response that is not the false reassurance and not the clinical management, but the honest witnessing. The testimony of the person who has been attentive to the dying person across the final period and who can say, from genuine observation rather than performance, what they have seen. The dying person who produced in the nurse's genuine observation a quality of character or love or humor or courage that the nurse genuinely witnessed. This dying person can receive from the nurse's honest testimony of the observation a partial answer to the question that matters more than any other. You mattered. I can see that you did. The nurse is the witness the dying person most needs for this specific answer. 77. The grief of anticipation. The hospice nurse who works with the family across the extended period of the dying, the weeks and months of the illness's final phase, before the death has yet occurred, observes in that family a form of grief that is distinct from the grief of the loss, and that the families themselves often do not recognize as grief. The anticipatory grief of the person who is in the presence of the impending loss, and who is beginning to grieve the loss in advance of its occurrence, while the person being lost is still present. The anticipatory grief is real, and it has the full emotional weight of the actual grief, which means that the family member who is experiencing it is living simultaneously in the present relationship with the dying person and in the anticipated future without them. And the combination is one of the most emotionally demanding conditions available in the ordinary civilian life. The family member who finds themselves weeping not at the news of the death, but in the ordinary evening of the dying period, in the specific moment of the ordinary life that is still shared with the dying person, is experiencing the anticipatory grief, the specific grief of the person who can already feel the shape of the absence that has not yet arrived. The nurse who understands the anticipatory grief wants families to know that it is a legitimate form of grief, that it is not the betrayal of the still living person that it can feel like, and that the anticipatory grief does not use up the grief that will be available after the death. The family member who fears that the crying they are doing before the death will leave them with nothing to cry after it is wrong about the arithmetic of grief. The grief is not a finite resource. The anticipatory grief is its own grief, doing its own work, preparing the family for the transition that is coming in the same way that the dying process itself is preparing the dying person for the transition they are undergoing. 78. The unexpected gift of the long illness. The hospice nurse who has attended dying people across the full range of the conditions of the dying, from the sudden death that the hospice receives in the final days or hours, to the long illness that brings the dying person into the hospice care months before the death, carries a consistent observation about the specific gift that the long illness provides to the dying person and the family. A gift that the sudden death cannot provide, and that the families who had the long illness consistently identify as one of the things they are most grateful for despite the genuine difficulty of its provision. The gift is time, not the time of the prior life, with its ordinary pressures and its ordinary management of the many things competing for the available hours. The specific time of the dying period, the time in which the ordinary pressures have receded, in which the priority of the relationship and the presence and the genuine being together has been established by the dying as the primary activity of the remaining hours, is time of a quality that the healthy life does not produce. The family that has had months with the dying person in the hospice care has had months of the most genuine quality of time available in the human life, the time that is organized around the most important thing, in the conditions where everything else has been cleared away to make the organization possible. The families who have had this time, who have had the months of the genuine conversations, the months of the genuine presence, the months of the saying of what needed to be said in the conditions where the saying was made possible by the approaching death's clarification of what was most important, describe the long illness, in the accounts they give the nurse in the period following the death, as a gift alongside the genuine difficulty. The dying person had time to leave well. The family had time to receive the leaving. The time was the gift. The sudden death does not provide it. The long illness, for all its genuine cost, does. 79. What the dying person most needs to hear. The hospice nurse who has observed the full range of the family's communication with the dying person across the dying period, who has heard the things that were said and the things that were not said, the things that landed with comfort and the things that landed with something else, carries a clear and consistent understanding of the things the dying person most needs to hear from the people who love them. An understanding built not from the theoretical consideration of what would be comforting, but from the direct observation of what the dying person's face and body communicate in response to the specific things that are said. What the dying person most consistently needs to hear is the account of their own significance, the honest, particular, specific account of the difference that their presence made in the life of the person speaking. Not the generic reassurance that they were loved, though the reassurance of the love is important and should be spoken. The more particular testimony, the specific memory of the specific thing that the dying person did that the speaking family member carries as the evidence of who the dying person was. The time the dying person showed up, the thing the dying person said, the quality of the dying person's presence in a specific moment that the family member has carried across the years of the relationship, and that the dying period is the occasion to return to the dying person as the testimony of what their presence actually provided. The dying person who hears this specific testimony, who receives from the specific people they loved the specific account of what their specific life meant to those specific people, receives the most complete answer available to the question they most consistently ask. They mattered. The evidence is here in the specific memory, spoken in the voice of the specific person who carries it. This is what the nurse wants family members to say, not the generic, the particular, the remembered, the real. 80, what we know at 80, almost everything has been said. We stand at the 80th entry, 20 from the end of the hospice nurse's testimony, and what has been assembled here, across 80 entries drawn from the years of the genuine presence at the threshold, is now visible in something close to its full form. Not a clinical account of the dying process, but the human account of what the dying process is, what it requires, what it provides, and what the person who has witnessed it many times most urgently wants the people who will encounter it to know. In the last 10 entries, we received the long arc of grief, and the nurse's understanding of what the non-linearity of it requires from the surrounding community. We received the account of the dying person's relationship with their pet. We heard the cultural dimensions of the dying that the universal framework cannot accommodate. We received the testimony of the death that changed the nurse. We heard what people actually pray for at the end. We understood the question the dying person most consistently asks and the nurse's response to it. We heard the grief of anticipation and its legitimacy. We received the unexpected gift of the long illness. And we heard what the dying person most needs to hear, not the generic reassurance, but the particular testimony of the specific remembered evidence of the specific life's significance. 20 entries remain. They are the final voice of the testimony, the things the nurse most wants to say in the moment closest to the silence, the things that the threshold has most consistently and most urgently produced in the nurse who has stood at it for years. The testimony is nearly complete. This is explored during sleeping. 81. The dying person's sense of completion. Among the dimensions of the dying person's interior experience that the hospice nurse observes most consistently across the final weeks, dimensions that the clinical framework for assessing the dying process does not capture, and that the family, focused on the external signs of the dying person's condition, does not always perceive, is the dying person's progressive development of a sense of completion. The gradual arrival, through the weeks of the final period, at a quality of finishedness about the life that the middle of the life does not produce, and that the dying period, in the nurse's consistent observation, tends to produce when the conditions of genuine honesty and genuine presence are present in the room. The sense of completion is not the same as the absence of regret. The dying person who has arrived at the sense of completion may still carry regrets, the things not done, the words not spoken, the specific unfinished dimensions of the life. What the sense of completion produces is not the erasure of those regrets, but the settling of them into a context larger than themselves. The context of the full life in which the regrets are part of the account but not the whole of it, and in which the account, taken as a whole and assessed honestly from the end of it, is sufficient. The life was enough. Not perfect. The nurse who has attended many dying people has never encountered the dying person who assessed their life as perfect, but enough. Genuine and enough, and genuinely theirs. The nurse observes this sense of completion arrive not as a dramatic turning point, but as a gradual settling. The quality of the dying person's face, the quality of the silences, the quality of the conversations that shift from the urgent and the unresolved toward the reflective and the grateful. When the nurse observes this settling, they carry it as one of the most important pieces of information available from the bedside. The dying person is arriving somewhere. The arrival is peaceful. The family that understands this shift can be with the dying person in the arriving rather than working against it. 82. The request the nurse finds hardest. The hospice nurse who has worked in end-of-life care encounters regularly a small number of requests from families that they find genuinely difficult to navigate, not because the requests are unreasonable in their motivation, but because the honoring of them conflicts with the nurse's understanding of what the dying person needs and what the dying person's own wishes are. The request the nurse finds hardest to manage is the request not to tell the dying person that they are dying. The family that makes this request is acting from genuine love and genuine protectiveness, from the specific conviction that the knowledge of the prognosis would harm the dying person. that the hope sustained by the not knowing is preferable to the peace that the knowing might provide, that the specific person they are protecting is better served by the managed version of the truth than by the truth itself. The nurse who encounters this request encounters it with the care and the respect that the love behind it deserves, and with the genuine difficulty of a position that requires them to navigate between the family's wish and the dying person's right. The right that the nurse is navigating toward is the right of the dying person to know what is happening to them, to be the subject of their own dying rather than the managed object of it, to have the opportunity to say what they need to say, and to do what they need to do in the remaining time, which the not knowing consistently forecloses. The dying person who does not know they are dying cannot give the permission, cannot say the goodbye, cannot have the honest conversation, cannot make the specific choices about the remaining time that the honest knowledge of its limit makes possible. The nurse who has observed the cost of the not telling, in the dying person's experience and in the family's subsequent grief, carries the consistent counsel that the truth, offered with the care and the compassion that the truth at the bedside requires, is the greater kindness. 83. What nurses have learned about preparing. The hospice nurse who has spent years attending the dying and their families carries, alongside the understanding of what the dying period requires, an understanding of what can be done before the dying period to make it more manageable, the preparations that the person who is not yet in the dying period can make that will change the quality of the experience when the dying period arrives, for themselves and for the people who love them. The preparation that the nurse most consistently identifies as the most important is the conversation about dying, conducted not in the crisis of the diagnosis, but in the ordinary time of the ordinary life, with the people who will be making decisions and providing care when the time comes. The conversation that establishes what matters, what is feared, what is wanted, and what is not wanted from the medical management of the final period. The conversation that answers in advance the questions that the dying period will generate in conditions of grief and urgency that make the answering of them extremely difficult. The families who had this conversation before the crisis consistently describe it as one of the most important things they did. The families who did not consistently describe the absence of it as one of their deepest regrets. The second preparation the nurse identifies is the practical one, the advanced directive, the organized financial and legal affairs, the communicated wishes about the funeral and the burial. These things are not morbid. They are the specific acts of love toward the people who will be managing the practical dimensions of the death in conditions of grief, and the management is made significantly more bearable by the specific knowledge of what the dying person wanted. The nurse who has sat with families trying to make decisions about the dying person's care without knowing what the dying person would have wanted carries the urgency of the preparation directly from the bedside. Do the preparation. It is the last gift you can give in advance. 84. The nurse's own relationship with mortality. The hospice nurse who has worked at the threshold for years develops, in the course of the work, a relationship with their own mortality that is different from the relationship most people in the ordinary life maintain with the fact of their own dying. The difference is not the absence of fear. The nurse is not invulnerable to the fear of dying, and the years at the bedside have not produced a philosophical serenity that places the nurse's own death outside the range of the fears that the ordinary person carries. The difference is the directness of the relationship. The nurse who has been at many deaths has a more concrete and a more honest sense of what their own dying might look like than the person whose relationship to dying has been mediated by the cultural representations rather than by the direct observation. What the direct observation has produced in most nurses who do the work honestly is not a resolution of the existential questions, but a more practical and a more proportionate relationship to them. The nurse who has observed many deaths knows something that the person who has not witnessed death directly tends not to know, that the dying process, in the conditions of the hospice care and the genuine human presence, is survivable in the sense that it is not the horror that the imagination of it tends to produce, that the dying person, in the majority of cases, is not in the conditions of the worst fear. That the final period, attended with genuine care, is humanly manageable in a way that the fear of it does not allow the person who has not been there to believe. The nurse carries this knowledge, not as a comfort that eliminates the seriousness of their own eventual dying, but as a more realistic framework for understanding what the dying will likely be. And they carry, alongside it, the specific counsel that the years at the bedside have produced about the prior life, about how to spend the time that remains before the dying, so that the arriving at the dying is the arriving of the person who has genuinely inhabited the life they were given, and who knows from the quality of the inhabiting that the life was worth having. 85. The language of the dying period. The hospice nurse who has attended many dying periods and who has observed the full range of how language functions in the room. What the dying person says, and what the family says, and what the nurse says, and what the silences between the sayings contain, carries an understanding of the specific ways in which the ordinary language of the ordinary life is both necessary and insufficient in the conditions of the dying period, and of the specific adjustments to the ordinary language that the dying period requires. The adjustment most consistently required is the adjustment toward the direct. The ordinary social language is organized around the management of the direct. The euphemisms, the diplomatic framings, the careful avoidances that the social life has learned to use in order to navigate difficult subjects without producing the discomfort that the direct address would produce. In the dying period, the management of the direct is a cost that the dying person consistently pays, and that the nurse consistently observes the dying person being relieved to have removed. The dying person who is told directly what is happening, who hears the honest account rather than the managed version, tends to receive the directness as a form of respect that the management had been withholding. The second adjustment is toward the simple. The dying period reduces the available energy for the complex, and the language that the dying person is most able to receive and most able to respond to in the final period is the simple language, the direct expression of the simple feeling, the short sentence that says the essential thing without the elaboration that the prior life's social sophistication tended to require. I love you, I am here, I am grateful for you. These are the sentences that the nurse observes landing with the most force and the most comfort in the conditions of the final period. The sentences that say the essential without the surrounding that the earlier period of the relationship might have required to feel complete. The dying period is not the place for the long speech. It is the place for the essential sentence, spoken directly, in the voice that the dying person has known across the years. 86. What the work has done to the nurses who do it. The hospice nurse who is asked what the years of the work at the threshold have done to them, what the accumulated experience of the genuine presence at the dying and the genuine witness to the grief has produced in the person who has provided it, offers an answer that is consistent across the many nurses who address the question honestly. The work has changed them in the direction of the things that matter, and the changed direction is something they would not undo. The change is not the change of the hardened person who has been made callous by the accumulated exposure to death. The nurse who does the work with genuine attention and genuine care is not hardened by the exposure. They are deepened by it, made more capable of the genuine human presence, more attentive to the quality of the ordinary life, more patient with the full range of the human response to the conditions of the extreme situation, and more honest about the things that matter and the things that do not. The work at the threshold produces in the nurse who does it honestly a specific quality of wisdom about the ordinary life that the ordinary life does not generate in the same form from within itself. The nurse who comes home from the day's work having been present at a death carries something into the ordinary evening that the person who was not at the bedside does not carry. They carry the specific clarity about the value of the person in the room with them, the value of the dinner table, the value of the morning. The dying person's testimony about what the life was worth is delivered daily to the nurse who has been listening to it across the years of the work, and the delivery produces in the recipient a quality of the living of the ordinary life that the person who has not been to the threshold does not yet have access to. The work was hard. The people it made them into are genuinely better equipped for the living of the life than the people they would have been without it. 87. The misconceptions about hospice. The hospice nurse who has worked in end-of-life care consistently encounters, in the families they work with and in the broader culture's understanding of what hospice is and what it provides, a set of misconceptions that have real and significant consequences for the dying person's access to the care and for the family's ability to make the decisions that would most genuinely serve the dying person's experience of the final period. The nurse who names these misconceptions does so not in the spirit of institutional advocacy, but in the spirit of the honest witness who has observed what the misconceptions cost in the specific situations where they prevented the dying person from receiving what the dying person needed. The most damaging misconception is the misconception that choosing hospice means giving up. The family that understands hospice as the acknowledgement of defeat, as the surrender of the hope for recovery, rather than the affirmative choice of a form of care that is organized around the dying person's experience of the remaining life, is the family that waits too long to make the referral, that reaches the hospice care in the final days rather than the final months, and that receives less of the specific gift that the hospice care provides as a result of the waiting. Hospice is not giving up on the person. It is choosing the form of care that is most genuinely organized around the person's experience of the remaining time. The second misconception is that hospice care means the dying person will receive less medical attention than in the acute care setting. What the dying person receives in the hospice setting is different attention. Attention organized around comfort and quality of life, rather than around the clinical management of the disease. And the different attention is, in the nurse's experience of the dying period, more genuinely responsive to the dying person's actual needs in the conditions of the final period than the acute care attention that is organized around different goals. 88. The dying person's final gift. The dying person who is well attended in the final period, who has the genuine presence of the people they love and the honest conversation, and the permission to be where they actually are rather than where the management of the family's grief requires them to perform being, tends to give, in the final period, a gift to the people who are attending them that the nurse observes with a consistency that makes it one of the most important findings from the bedside, the gift of the model. The dying person who dies well, who approaches the dying with the honesty and the presence and the grace that the genuine human being is capable of in the conditions of the most honest experience of their own existence, is demonstrating to the family that is present at the death something that no other demonstration is capable of providing. The direct, embodied, witnessed evidence of what it looks like to face the fundamental human situation with the full quality of the human response to it. The family that was present at the death that was well died carries, in the years following the death, not only the grief of the loss but the testimony of the witnessing, the specific knowledge of what the dying person was in the conditions of the dying, and the implicit instruction that the witness contains for the people who will one day be in the same position. This is the gift that the dying person gives when the dying period is genuinely inhabited, the instruction of the witnessed death. The nurse who has been present at many deaths and who has observed this gift being given and received describes it as one of the most important things the dying process produces, more important, in the long account of the family's experience of the death, than any of the clinical achievements of the dying period. The dying person became the teacher. The family became the students. The instruction was given in the only language adequate to the subject, the language of the actual doing of the thing itself. 89. What the threshold has taught about ordinary life. The hospice nurse who is asked what the years at the threshold have most taught them about the ordinary life, the life away from the bedside, the life of the ordinary evening and the ordinary morning and the ordinary people who are not dying, offers an answer that is both simple and difficult. Simple in its statement, and difficult in the sense that the living of it requires the consistent practice of the awareness that the work has produced, and that the ordinary life consistently works to diminish. What the threshold teaches about the ordinary life is that it is genuinely good. Not perfect. The nurse who has been at the bedside of many dying people carries too honest a relationship to the full account of human experience to claim that the ordinary life is perfect. But genuinely good, in the way that the genuine goods of the ordinary life are genuinely good when they are genuinely received. The specific morning, the specific cup, the specific quality of the light in the specific room at the specific hour, the specific person at the table, the specific conversation that is happening right now, and that is genuinely worth the full quality of the attention it is being offered. The threshold teaches this not through the philosophical argument, but through the direct testimony of the people who are at the far end of the life, and who can see, from the specific vantage of the approaching conclusion, what the specific goods of the ordinary life were worth. The nurse who receives this testimony daily, who hears it in the regrets and the gratitudes and the life reviews, and the specific things the dying person says to the family in the conditions of the final period, carries it back into the ordinary life as the most direct and the most urgent instruction available from the years of the work. The ordinary life is the good life. The goodness is available right now. The nurse has been told this, again and again, by the people who are in the position to know it most clearly. They want everyone who receives this testimony to know it too. 90. What we know at 90, the final approach. We stand at the 90th entry, and the testimony of the hospice nurse is now in its final passage. 10 entries from the place where the testimony is complete, and the silence that follows all honest testimony begins. In the last 10 entries, we receive the most intimate and the most carefully held dimensions of the nurse's witness, the dying person's arrival at the sense of completion, and what it looks like from the outside, the request the nurse finds hardest to honor, and why the truth is the greater kindness, what can be done before the dying period to change its quality, the nurse's own relationship with mortality, and what the direct observation of many deaths produces in the person who has observed them. The language of the dying period and the adjustments it requires, what the years of the work have done to the people who do it, the misconceptions about hospice that cost the dying person the care they need, the gift of the witnessed death, and the consistent, urgent, daily testimony of the threshold about the value of the ordinary life. 10 entries remain. They carry the final things the nurse most wants to say, the things distilled from all the years and all the bedside hours and all the hands held and all the families attended, into the form that is most direct and most useful to the person who receives them. The testimony has one last voice. This is explored during Sleeping 91, the one thing the nurse wishes everyone knew before arriving at the bedside. When the hospice nurse is asked what single piece of knowledge they most wish every family member possessed before they arrived at the bedside of the dying person for the first time, before the shock of the dying person's changed appearance and the reality of the changed situation had produced the specific disorientation that the unprepared encounter with a dying person consistently generates, the answer across the many nurses who address the question is the same answer, stated in different ways but pointing toward the same essential understanding. The thing the nurse most wishes every family member knew is that the dying person is still the person. That the body that has been changed by the illness and the dying process is still the body of the person who was known and loved across the years of the relationship, and that the changes in the body are not the erasure of the person, but the evidence of the process the person is in, and that the person in the process deserves the same quality of genuine human regard that the person in full health deserved and received. The family member who arrives at the bedside and who is so confronted by the changed body that they cannot find the person inside the change is a family member who may withdraw from the presence that the dying person most needs, and the withdrawal, however understandable in its occasion, is the specific deprivation of the specific good at the moment of its greatest necessity. The nurse who carries this as the single most important piece of prior knowledge wants the family to arrive at the bedside prepared to look past the change, prepared to seek the person in the changed body, to speak to the person rather than to the condition, to hold the hand and to be present with the human being who is still there in the changed form, needing the same quality of genuine regard that they needed throughout the prior life. The person is still there. The change is real. The change is not the person. Look for the person. They are in there. They are waiting to be seen. 92. What the dying person most wanted the world to know. The hospice nurse who has received the life reviews, heard the final communications, and been present at the dying person's most honest moments across the full span of the final period, carries an understanding of what the dying person most consistently wanted, not the specific people who loved them, who received their own specific communications, but the broader world, the people who will come after them, to know. This is the testimony the dying person generates not for the family in the room, but for the human community of which they were a member and from which they are departing, and whose ongoing life they can still, from the position of the final weeks, address. What the dying person most consistently wants the world to know is the same thing that all the wisdom testimony assembled in this account has been pointing toward from its first entry, that the ordinary life is the thing worth attending to. Not the accumulated version, not the managed and performed version, not the version organized around the maintenance of the appearance of the successful life. The actual ordinary life, the specific morning, the specific relationship, the specific quality of the genuine engagement with the genuine people in the genuine present moment, is the thing. The dying person who has seen the full account of the life from the position of the approaching conclusion, who has done the final accounting of what the years actually contained and what they were actually worth, points from the final weeks with a consistency and an urgency that makes the pointing one of the most repeated and the most reliable pieces of testimony available from the threshold. The ordinary life is the thing worth attending to. The attending is available right now. Do not wait until the approaching conclusion to begin. 93. The request the nurse makes of the living. The hospice nurse's testimony, accumulated from the years of the genuine presence at the threshold, from the thousands of hours of the genuine witness to the dying and the grieving, and the occasional extraordinary quality of the genuine human meeting in the conditions of the final period, reaches its most direct address in the request it makes of the people who receive it. The request that is not a counsel, and not an instruction, and not a philosophical position, but the direct appeal of the person who has been where the testimony comes from, and who wants, with the specific urgency of the person whose professional life is organized around the evidence of what the ordinary life is worth, for the person who receives the testimony to do something with it. The request is the same request that the dying person's testimony makes, that the elderly wisdom makes, that the soldier's wisdom makes, that the person who lost everything and rebuilt makes. Be here. Not here in the superficial sense of the physical presence. Here in the sense of the genuine, full, undivided attention to the actual life that is actually happening in the actual room with the actual people right now. The life that the dying person spent the final weeks pointing toward from the far end of it is the life that is currently available at this end of it. The specific morning, the specific person, the specific quality of the unremarkable day that is, in the testimony of every person who has stood at the threshold and looked back across the full account of the lived years, the thing that was genuinely worth the living of it. The nurse's request is this: do not wait until the threshold to understand what the threshold teaches. The threshold will come. When it comes, it will teach what it teaches, and the teaching will be received in the form it always arrives in, direct, clear. And in many cases too late to change the years that preceded it. Receive it now, from the testimony of the people who are offering it freely, in the conditions where the receiving is still the beginning of the living, rather than the conclusion of it. 94. The quality of the death and the quality of the grief. The hospice nurse who has observed the families of the dying in the years following the death, who has maintained the relationship with the family through the bereavement support that the hospice program provides, and who has observed the long arc of the family's grief across the months and the years after the death, carries an understanding of the relationship between the quality of the dying period and the quality of the grief that follows it that is one of the most practically significant findings in the entire testimony. The relationship is consistent. The families who had the well-inhabited dying period, the period of genuine presence, honest communication, permission given, love expressed, the things said that needed to be said, tend to carry the grief of the loss differently than the families who did not. Not less grief, the loss is the same loss, and the person is the same person, and the absence produced by the death is the same absence regardless of the quality of the period that preceded it. But the grief is less complicated, less entangled with the specific regrets of the things that were not said, and the specific guilts of the things that were not done in the window that has now closed. The grief, stripped of the complicating weight of the unfinished, can be the pure grief of the loss, which is difficult enough, and which the family who has it can grieve without the additional burden of the things they carry that are not grief but the weight of the missed opportunity. The nurse who carries this understanding wants families approaching the dying period to know that the quality of the period is not determined by circumstances outside their control. It is determined in large part by the specific choices the family makes about how to inhabit the time that remains, the honest conversation, the genuine presence, the expressed love, the given permission. These things are available to most families in most circumstances. They produce a dying period that, in the nurse's consistent observation, leaves the family with the grief they can carry and without the weight they cannot. The quality of the dying period is the gift you give to your future grieving self. The giving is available now. 95. Unarung the dying and unarung the living. The hospice nurse's understanding of what it means to honor the dying person, to genuinely respect the specific personhood and the specific wishes and the specific dignity of the person who is in the process of leaving the world, is, in the most complete formulation the years of the work have produced, inseparable from the understanding of what it means to honor the living. The people who are remaining, who will carry the experience of the dying period into the subsequent years of their lives, and whose experience of the dying period is shaped by the choices made in it in ways that persist long after the specific memory of the specific hours has faded. The honor of the dying person is the honor of the centered wish. The dying person's own account of what they want from the final period made the organizing principle of the care, placed above the family's grief-driven preferences and the institution's procedurally preferred options. When the dying person's own wishes are centered, the dying person is unarud. And the dying person who is unarud, who experiences the final period as genuinely their own, whose specific preferences about the environment and the visitors and the medical management and the quality of the presence are genuinely respected, dies with a quality of dignity that the family who witnesses it carries as the most complete form of the goodbye available. The honor of the living is the honor of the full experience, the permission for the genuine grief, the support for the genuine time that the genuine grief requires, the honest account of the dying period offered without management in the service of the institutional comfort or the cultural expectation. The family that is genuinely supported through the dying period and the grief that follows it is a family that carries the experience as something that was genuinely attended to, genuinely witnessed, and genuinely unarud. Both honors are the nurse's work. Neither is complete without the other. 96. What love actually looks like at the end. The hospice nurse who has observed love in its most honest and its most stripped-down form, in the conditions of the dying period, where the ordinary social performances of the relationship have been removed by the urgency of the situation, and what remains is the actual quality of the actual bond, carries one of the most direct and the most moving accounts of what love actually looks like when all the surrounding circumstance has been cleared away. Love at the end of the life looks like the hand that is held without the requirement of the holding producing anything beyond the holding itself. It looks like the person who comes back, day after day, to the room where the dying person is, because the coming back is what the love requires, and the love knows what it requires. It looks like the silence that is genuinely comfortable between two people who have known each other across the full arc of the years, and who have, in the conditions of the final period, arrived at the place where the silence is sufficient, where the being together is the full expression of what the relationship is, without the requirement for the verbal or the active or the useful to supplement it. Love at the end of the life looks like the specific thing said at the specific moment that the dying person most needed to hear it. Not the planned speech, not the organized summary of the relationship's significance, but the honest and direct expression of the thing that was most true and most needed, and that the person who said it found the courage to say because the conditions of the final period had removed the reasons for not saying it. Love at the end looks like what it always was at the best moments of the prior years of the relationship. The specific, particular, unrepeatable quality of the genuine regard of one person for another, present now in the conditions that make it most fully itself. The conditions of nothing left to perform, and nothing left to manage, and nothing remaining, but the actual relationship in its most honest and its most complete form. 97. The final simplification. The testimony of the hospice nurse, accumulated from the years of the genuine presence at the threshold, from the thousands of bedside hours and the thousands of hands held and the thousands of final moments witnessed, resolves, in the most honest and the most complete formulation available, into a simplification whose simplicity is not the simplicity of the superficial, but the simplicity of the thing that has been distilled through the full complexity of the experience, and that emerges from the distillation clearer and more essential than it was before the distillation began. The final simplification is this: the people matter, not the achievements, not the possessions, not the status, not the management of the appearance of the successful life. The people. The specific, particular, irreplaceable people whose presence in the specific life made it the specific life it was, whose hands were held, whose voices were known, whose specific qualities of character and humor and love and difficulty were the actual content of the actual experience of being alive in the actual years that were available. The dying person's final accounting is almost never the accounting of the things accomplished. It is the accounting of the people, who they were, what they gave, whether the giving was received and returned in the forms that the relationship required. The nurse who has received this accounting from many dying people, across many years, carries it as the most direct and the most urgent available testimony about how the ordinary life is best organized. Organize it around the people. Not around the management of the people's opinion, not around the performance for the people's judgment, but around the genuine attending to the specific people who are in the room with you, in the specific time that is currently available, with the full quality of the genuine human attention that the dying person at the end of the life consistently identifies as the thing they most wish they had given more of, and the thing they are most grateful for having received. 98. What nurses once said at funerals. The hospice nurse who has attended dying people, and who has observed the funerals and the memorial services that the deaths eventually produced, carries a wish about what is said at those services. Not a prescribed format or a preferred liturgy, but a wish about the quality of the account of the life that the service offers to the people who gather to acknowledge that the life occurred and that it mattered. The wish is for the particular, the funeral that offers the generic eulogy, the assembled virtues, the summarized accomplishments, the described character in the terms that could apply to many people in many lives, is not the funeral that provides the specific community of the specific person's specific life with the testimony they came to receive. The testimony they came to receive is the specific testimony, the story that only the people who knew this person can tell, the account of the specific moment and the specific quality and the specific way that this particular human being was in the world. The story that makes the people in the room say, yes, that was them. That was exactly them. The nurse who has heard the life review, who has been trusted with the account of the moments that mattered, and the people who shaped and were shaped by the life, carries the consistent wish that the people who speak at the service tell those stories. The specific memory, the specific moment of the specific character that the life was organized around. The thing the dying person did that was uniquely theirs, the specific humor, the specific generosity, the specific stubbornness, the specific quality of the specific love that the specific person provided to the specific people who are now gathered to remember them. The particular is what honors the particular life. The nurse wants the particular to be spoken. 99. The return, what the nurse carries back. The hospice nurse who leaves the bedside and returns to the ordinary life, to the evening at home, to the people in the kitchen, to the unremarkable quality of the unremarkable day, carries something back from the threshold that the person who did not go to the threshold is not carrying. They carry it not as a burden, though in some hours it has the weight of a burden, and not as a gift in the simple sense, though in the honest accounting it is a gift alongside the cost of its provision. They carry it as the testimony of the witness, the testimony that is most alive in the specific hours following the specific death, and that settles, across the days and the weeks and the years of the continuing work, into the permanent furnishing of the interior. The testimony they carry back is the testimony of the specific person who died in the specific manner of the specific dying. The account of what the dying person was in the conditions that revealed them most completely. The account of what they said, and what they needed, and what they were most grateful for, and what they most regretted, and what they wanted the people who were remaining to understand about how to spend the remaining time. This testimony, received in the conditions of the nurse's genuine presence at the genuine threshold, is the most direct available instruction about the value of the ordinary life, about what the ordinary life actually contains, and what it is actually worth, and what the spending of it most genuinely requires. The nurse carries it home. They put it in the ordinary evening. They sit at the table with the people who are there. They are more genuinely present than they might have been if they had not been at the threshold that day, because the threshold reminded them, as it always reminds them, of what the table is worth and who the people are, and why the evening that is currently happening is the thing that the dying person at the end of the life was pointing toward from the far end of the experience. The nurse is here. In the ordinary evening, knowing what it is worth, they want you to know too. 100. What the nurse leaves with you. Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Let the darkness settle around you like the darkness of the room where someone has just left, the specific quiet that follows the last breath, when the ordinary world returns to the room that has been holding something larger than the ordinary, and when the people in the room are left with the most important thing the dying person could offer, the testimony of the life and the specific instruction that the dying always leaves for the living. We have arrived together at the 100th entry. We have traveled in these 100 entries through the full testimony of the hospice nurses, through the dying process and its actual character, through the family at the bedside and the things that help and the things that do not, through the visions and the permissions and the last hours and the moment of death and the immediate aftermath and the long arc of the grief that follows, through the life review and the final question and the dying person's sense of completion, through the nurse's own grief and the nurse's own relationship with mortality and the nurse's own return to the ordinary evening, carrying the threshold's testimony about what the ordinary evening is worth. What the nurse leaves with you in this final entry, at the conclusion of the testimony, is not a clinical protocol and not a philosophical system and not a prescription for the dying period. It is the account of what the nurse has witnessed across the years of the genuine presence at the most honest moment available in the human life, offered freely and directly to the person who is still in the middle of the living, so that the middle of the living might be spent with the understanding that the end of the living consistently produces in the people who arrive at it with sufficient honesty to see what is actually there. The dying person most consistently points toward the people. The nurse brings the pointing back into the world and sets it in the ordinary life and asks the person in the ordinary life to receive it, to feel the specific weight of it, which is the weight of everything the ordinary evening is worth, and to carry that weight forward into the ordinary morning with the quality of attention that the dying person's testimony most urgently requests. The people in the room with you right now are more important than almost anything else currently competing for your attention. The morning will come, be in it. The people who are there will not always be there. Be with them while they are. The ordinary life is the good life. The nurse has been told this again and again by the people who are in the position to know it most completely. Now you have been told it too. Sleep now, let the testimony settle into the quiet of the night. What was offered here was true, and it was earned at the highest possible price, and it belongs to anyone who receives it with the honesty it was given with. This is explored during sleeping.